July 2019, upstate New York. An unknown user uploads extraordinarily violent and morbid images to a globally viewed social media application.
No one had seen anything like this before, where anybody would share such gruesome photos and continue to share them. And it attracted media and attention from all over the world.
Utica police received numerous 911 calls, including from someone claiming responsibility for uploading the photos and what they depict.
It's going to be there's a murder-suicide.
Okay, what's your name?
My name is Brandon. The victim is Bianca Michelle Devins.
The photos, showing a dead teenager, are being rapidly shared online.
You really saw the underbelly and underside and dark side of the internet where, people were praising Brandon for his act.
As the details start to emerge, it becomes clear that it is a murder, and it has been methodically planned.
The internet was the way that Brandon broadcasted his crime.
He wanted to set the stage so that he was remembered in perpetuity.
This is the tragic story of Bianca Devins, the gruesome and distressing details of her murder, and how the downside of modern technology makes it a global story.
This jealousy boils over to a point of murder.
Brandon viewed the relationship a whole lot differently, and he wanted more than what she was willing to give him, and ultimately he couldn't handle that rejection.
Just after 6 a.m. on July the 14th, 2019, police in Oneida County, upstate New York, receive 911 calls reporting macabre and disturbing photos that have been uploaded to Discord, a popular group chatting app, by a 21-year-old named Brandon Clark.
The Oneida County 911 dispatch received a call from an individual in Tennessee about a picture, for lack of a better word, that was posted online of a young individual who was described and named to be Bianca Devins of Utica, New York.
We're also getting a bunch of 911 calls from people from different states saying Brandon Clark uploaded some photographs to various social media websites like Instagram, Discord, of Bianca's throat slit by Brandon. This might be a murder. We're not sure, but we don't, kind of don't want to be the person that just scrolls past it and doesn't do anything. We're also getting 911 calls from a Philip Jakes Johnson, who is a friend of Brandon Clark, who Brandon has called him to basically tell him what he's done. And at the end of that call, Mr. Jake Johnson also calls 911. He's unsure where Brandon is at that time, but has just been told by Brandon that he's murdered his girlfriend.
While police scramble to locate Bianca Devins' home address, they receive a call that stops them in their tracks. The call is from supposed killer Brandon Clark.
There's going to be there's a murder-suicide.
Okay. On Post Street, you said?
The end of Post Street, yes.
Okay. Very end of Post Street. Okay, what's your name?
My name is Brandon. The victim is Bianca Michelle Devins.
Yeah. What are you wearing?
It doesn't matter. I'm going to be dead.
Okay, well, I just want to talk to you, okay?
Yeah, I know you want to talk to me. I know how your job works. You have to keep me on the line, but it's not happening, okay?
He told the 911 operator that she should advise police to bring a cooler because he was an organ donor, and that perhaps in his committing suicide, his organs could be harvested and used for the greater good.
Utica police are dispatched to Post Street and also to Bianca Devins' home address where her mother answers.
Bianca's mother was able to tell us that on the 13th of July, she had gone to a concert in Queens, New York to see Nicole Dollinger. She told us that she went with an individual by the name of Brandon Clark. She told us that they went early afternoon hours on the 13th and were expected to arrive during the morning hours of the 14th. It was certainly a surprise to Bianca's mother that she had not returned, and certainly quite a unwelcome wake-up that the information that she may be in danger.
Officers heading to the Post Street location are being slowed down by a huge event taking place in the city.
It was the day of the Boilermaker Road Race. That is a very large race that's held here in the city of Utica. The crime having happened here in Utica was actually right along the road race route. You can see that it takes police a little bit longer than usual to actually get to the crime scene because they're trying to navigate through blocked off roadways for this race. And at the same time, you have runners at the starting line. The race has now been delayed, who are concerned that there has been some type of incident or crime perpetrated, against the event.
We had to make our way on foot, so it was about a 2-mile trek that we had to get there and walk to the scene through the road race.
Officer Zaza is the first to arrive at Post Street, and initially can't see anything suspicious.
Post Street is a residential street in the city that dead ends into our park system. The pavement for the street actually extends into the wooded area.
He passes by kind of the last residence and doesn't really notice anything unusual. It's not until he looks further down the end of Post Street where he notices this black SUV in the wooded area, as well as a bonfire.
The officer exits his vehicle and approaches the SUV.
The first concern of Officer Zaza upon arriving on scene was the care and concern of Bianca Devins, certainly considering that the pictures posted online we had received and were aware that she had maybe been injured or at worst death.
To the right of the car, the first thing Officer Zaza sees is there's like a green tarp, and Clark is laying in front of, kind of his feet are almost extended by the car, so he's like perpendicular to the tarp.
He kind of holds him at gunpoint, unsure if anybody else is even at the scene, if there's other people there. It's a very wooded area.
As he surveys the scene more closely, the officer realizes that Clark is armed.
At that point, Officer Zaza makes a decision not to physically engages him with verbal conversation.
With no sign of Bianca, Officer Zaza asks Clark about her.
Where's the girl? What do you think? Where is she? Where do you
As Officer Zaza waits for backup to arrive, Clark raises the knife and starts cutting himself.
Brandon Clark starts to cut his own throat. And while he's doing that, he's got his phone held up taking what we would call selfies at this point. Backup does eventually arrive, and Officer Zaza, along with 3 other officers, are able to disarm Clark. They actually kick the knife into the woods. He struggles with them. The struggle goes from, as they're trying to apprehend him, all the way past the front of the car, kind of over by the bonfires, where they originally are then able to take him into custody.
While Brandon is being rushed to hospital with life-threatening injuries, officers approach the green tarp.
As I arrive on scene, that is when Brandon was being wheeled on a stretcher from the actual scene to the ambulance. At that point, I was directed to the green tarp, and that's where we located Bianca's body.
It is immediately clear to detectives that Bianca Devins is dead. Brandon Clark is not only the prime suspect, but the vital witness they need to unlock the inquiry.
He was able to give himself a very deep laceration to his throat. As he was being wheeled on the stretcher, I remember looking at his face, and it didn't look good to me. I'm not a medical professional, but I have seen people with severe injuries in the past, and he appeared to have the look on his face that he may not make it.
With Brandon Clark being treated in hospital for the life-threatening self-inflicted cut to his throat, Utica police are processing the crime scene and Bianca Devins' body.
Her body was positioned in such a way that her hands were folded across her chest, but she had a very, very significant injury to her neck. At the end of the processing of the scene on Post Street, the medical examiner removed Bianca's body to Syracuse, New York, where the autopsy was performed. 10 to 15 yards in front of the black Ford Explorer was a fire that had just been recently put out but was still smoldering, and remnants of what appeared to be hard drives, other metal objects, notebooks, things of that nature.
There were various bound pieces of paper, so they tried to pull those items to see if we could extract any information from them, which ultimately we weren't able to do. The hard drives or tablets were too badly burned, as were some of the papers. We really couldn't see what was in there.
We collected 2 knives at the scene. We believe that he had one knife that he killed Bianca with, the other knife he was probably using on himself. A length of rope. Again, we don't know what the purpose of that was, but given the fact that he tried to commit suicide, we thought maybe he had thought of hanging himself.
One of the last items of evidentiary value that we had removed back to the Utica Police Department was the black Ford Explorer. The back seat had been folded down to allow greater access to the cargo area, and there was an immense amount of blood and other biological matter.
It was clear that the vehicle contained evidence that clearly depicted that the crime of the murder occurred in the vehicle.
What police find next at the crime scene is a key piece of evidence: Brandon Clark's phone.
One of the most important things that they find is they see a cell phone on the ground that is playing a song. We found out on our own research it's a song called Test Drive by an artist named Joji, and it's on repeat. Officer Mahay from the Utica Police Department ultimately picks up that phone and realizes that because the phone is playing this music through a Bluetooth speaker, that the phone is open or unlocked. He then collects that phone, and for the next almost 9 hours, back at the police station, keeps touching the phone every couple minutes to make sure it doesn't lock in order for us to, once we get the search warrant, to be able to go into that phone. Those were the main things that were recovered, including Bianca's phone, which did have some evidentiary value just in learning about her and her contact with Mr. Clark, albeit very brief up to that point in time in July, gave us some insight as to their relationship at that point in time.
While the scene is being processed, Utica police are trying to determine where the murder actually took place.
We were trying to decide where it was that she was killed. We didn't necessarily know that she was killed here in Utica. We needed to figure out, was she killed in New York City and brought here? Was she killed somewhere along the way? We knew that he lived in Syracuse. Did he take her to Syracuse, kill her, and then bring her here?
Which is important because if she wasn't killed in Utica, the jurisdiction of the case would have to be in that location.
One of the things that were helpful for us was he had an Easy Pass. That Easy Pass we were able to get a record of, which kind of showed us when he left New York City, when he got on the thruway, when he got off the exit here, and we were able to see that he didn't stop in Syracuse prior to coming here.
Officers break the tragic news to Bianca's family.
Her family was advised of what was going on basically in real time as we were at her house speaking with her mother while we were on scene on Post Street. So they were advised relatively quickly of what was going on. It was really hard for them, pretty devastating for them. We met them here at the Utica Police Headquarters and had to sit down with the family to advise them of everything that we had that was going on within 24 hours of the incident.
A full murder investigation opens into Bianca Devin's death, and detectives start interviewing those closest to her.
We did learn from her family that she suffered from some mental health issues that she was coming to terms with and was seeking help for.
The counseling center had helped her, and she seemed to have really turned her life around, was becoming close with her mother and happy about her life. And she had had self-image problems in the past, but it seemed that the counseling and her time in the clinic had helped her.
Facebook, Tumblr, Discord, 4chan, And through all those different things, she, expressed a side of her that necessarily wasn't being expressed in her real life. In her real life, she was somewhat shy, and online she wasn't.
She used that platform to express herself and the positive things that she had in her life. And again, it was putting out there things about her mental health and about how she's dealing with it to let other people or other kids, probably more than anything else, know that you're not alone.
She really had this online community where she got a lot of support. She had a lot of friends, not only all across the United States, but she had some friends internationally as well, people that she would speak to regularly. So it seemed like she had really made a lot of connections outside her Utica bubble, but in the online world.
I think she just was looking forward to life, and unfortunately, she didn't get that chance.
Investigators learned that Bianca and Clark had only met quite recently and viewed the relationship differently.
As far as we know, it was sometime in the end of May when they began to really communicate over Instagram. And then shortly thereafter, in recognizing that geographically they didn't live that far apart, they began to spend time actually physically together.
He was from the Syracuse area, which is, 35 to 45 minutes away.
Bianca trusted Brandon. She considered him her close friend. Her family trusted him.
He was at her high school graduation. He was at the after party for her graduation.
We also knew that Bianca had, in fact, been out to visit Brandon's family. So, both families and both sets of individuals were well acquainted with one another.
This was somebody that she did bring around. This wasn't a secret boyfriend or a secret relationship that she was having. This is somebody that she was definitely having a relationship with. It's just the scale of the relationship they were having were different in both of their minds.
She was a lot younger than him. She was at the time period of her life where I think she just wanted to go out and have fun and be a teenager and be someone that just graduated from high school, and she was looking forward to going to college. Where he, I think, was at the stage of his life where he goes, I just met my trophy girlfriend. I want to marry her. I want her to be my property and only my property. And, and those two things collided, and as they often do, not just in Bianca's case, but in many cases where, that possessive personality where, you belong to me instead of, we're going to share some time together. We're going to share, our love with each other turns into, if I can't have you, nobody else will.
Bianca was not as serious about the relationship as Brandon was. According to her mother, Bianca would not go as far as to call them boyfriend and girlfriend, that she referred to him as a friend.
I think it's very clear that Bianca does not feel the same way about Brandon.
Investigators also contact Brandon's family to try to find out what could have triggered this anger.
Brandon Clark obtained different odd jobs. At one point, he was a Lyft driver. He drove for different ride-sharing services. He did odd jobs for an individual in a construction capacity. He grew up in a very violent household with his father and mother. He bounced around between foster carers and family members who would take him in for periods of time. He never really had a niche in life, and he was searching for that, and I think he saw something he really loved in Bianca and wanted to hold on to it.
But with that going on, he had people in his life that did care for him, including his aunt and his grandmother. We found out he had actually left his grandmother a voicemail admitting that he had killed Bianca.
To replay this message, press 4.
Hey, Grandma, it's Brandon. I hope I would be able to reach you, but I guess I'm not able to, so I know this is going to come as kind of a surprise, at least to you it isn't to me, but I killed someone today. I killed my girlfriend. Well, she's supposed to be my girlfriend, but she cheated on me, and I just...
Detectives visit Clark's home, and it's evident his actions were well thought out and planned. It also gives officers an insight into his mind.
He was living with his aunt at the time. When they got there, she directed him to his basic room. He collected a lot of different things, comic books and toys, and the main thing that was located in Brandon's room was this handwritten note, kind of like, I want this person to have that, I want this person to have that, and kind of just put in there that, I'm not going to be around anymore, and I'm sorry for that, but here's what I'd like to have done with my stuff. Here's who I'd like to have you contact and let them know I'm sorry and that I love them. It included his parents, his grandmother.
For us, the importance it had was he wrote that note before he went to pick her up, before he went to the concert with her, and he didn't go back. So he had done it all in advance, which for us was evidence that this was certainly something that was planned by him in advance.
Images of the murder taken by Brandon Clark are being shared and are spreading rapidly throughout the global online community.
No one had seen anything like this before, where anybody would share such gruesome photos and continue to share them. And it attracted media and attention from all over the world.
The images were up for a period of time before we could contact the social media to get them to take them down. There's a lot that goes into play with taking images off a social media site. There's First Amendment issues that are involved. There are other issues at play when it comes to censoring posts on social media sites. There's certain rights that people have to post what they would like.
People made copies of them, and to this day, it's impossible to stop somebody from putting it on whatever platform they want. Some of these photographs are being actually sent to the family, which I don't understand that logic, why anyone would want to do that to a loved one.
There are some people that are just very cold and very cruel and did not take into account the fact that every time this picture is shared, its potential to re-victimize Bianca's family.
People are attracted to that type of disturbing behavior, and there are people out there, a small percentage of the population, that seek their own attention, and by sharing that, brings that attention to them.
You really saw the underbelly and underside and dark side of the internet, where people were praising Brandon for his act. There's this whole subsection of individuals who call themselves incels, and they blame the female genre for creating situations in which men cannot have love with females. And those particular individuals and those like them were praising Brandon for his act, and they were sharing that image everywhere and saying that this was Bianca's fault for being an e-girl and being a tease and creating an internet life where all she wanted was attention, and Brandon was in the right for taking that away from her.
As the murder investigation continues, detectives learn of a third person who attended the concert with Clark and Bianca on the night in question. The man's name was Alex.
Once we were able to extract information from Bianca's phone, we learned that she was having a conversation with Alex via text message. At that point, we were able to get his cell phone information, his cell phone number, and ultimately be able to track him down to where he lived in New Jersey. And we were able to have a conversation with him, and then he shed some light on what the relationship was between them and what had happened at the concert.
Utica police are investigating the murder of 17-year-old Bianca Devins. On the night of the murder, Bianca had spent the evening with two men she had met online, Alex and another man, the prime suspect, Brandon Clark.
We learned that him and Bianca started an online relationship that led to text messages. We learned that at the venue was the first time that they had ever met in person.
We do learn from Alex that they leave the concert together and they go to a bodega where the plan is for Brandon to go into the store to buy rolling papers, which by accounts he does. He goes into the store, and Bianca and Alex have a conversation and share a kiss at that point. It seems that after that, the kiss is observed and witnessed by Brandon. that the three of them get back in the car and start to smoke marijuana, but Brandon does not partake. So it's just Alex and Bianca. And according to Alex, they begin to have a conversation. It gets kind of tense between Alex and Brandon about this conversation. And Alex, Brandon, and Bianca kind of go their separate ways. Alex heads back to his home, and he is communicating with Bianca as Bianca and Brandon are coming back up here to where Bianca lives. And some of the messages, I believe, are Bianca tells him, you know, I think he saw us, and I think he's kind of mad, he's upset.
Utica police contact NYPD to retrieve the CCTV footage from the event and confirm Alex's story.
We have them on venue camera arriving at the location. It's a very small venue, and it's a small gathering at the Nicole Dollanganger concert. You can see the three of them just kind of standing in the back. And Alex is actually, he's a very tall person. He's well over 6 feet. And so he's pretty easily identifiable in the small venue. So the three of them stand there for the duration of the concert, and then they leave.
Detectives start piecing together Bianca and Brandon's movements after leaving Alex.
We know through the assistance of the New York State Police and the New York City Police Department that both Brandon and Bianca were returning to Utica, New York, crossing the Whitestone Bridge at around 11:30 p.m. We also know that about 3:05 a.m. they got off on exit 30, Herkimer, New York, in intent to ride back at Utica, New York. So, typical fashion, it was about a 4-hour ride from New York City to Utica, and they arrived on Post Street shortly after 3 a.m.
Investigators and the DA's office receive information that forensics has uncovered extremely disturbing evidence on Brandon's phone.
We received a phone call from our investigator who was conducting the forensic download of the phone and advised us that basically that this crime was committed on video. It had been recorded. And at that point, you can imagine how shocked we were that this piece of evidence existed. And so we went to go view the video, and it was about as horrific as you can imagine it to be.
What we see is it's perhaps the worst thing I've ever seen in my 9 years as a prosecutor. It starts with Brandon and Bianca in the back seat, and Brandon takes his cell phone, he has it on record, and he puts it in like a vent clip in the front of the car, right on the dash. And then he sits back, and you can see that he's facing the right way, facing forward, but that Bianca he has the seats pushed back so that her legs are almost in the trunk because the back seat is laying flat in the SUV, and her head is up by the driver's seat, and she appears to be sleeping in the back. The next thing you see is Brandon reaches behind him to the right into the trunk, and you see him pull out that black-handled knife that's in the photographs that he's posted to Discord. At that point, he wakes her up, and we can see that she's still alive. She's uninjured, and for us, we learn a couple of very important things. One, we can see, because of how the camera is on the dash, we can see right out the back window of the trunk. So we know they're on Post Street. So now the question of where she's killed is solved and answered for us. We know she's alive when they get here to Utica, that she's been alive from when they left New York City to the whole drive here. And then he confronts her. He confronts her about the kiss that he witnessed. She tells him that she's sorry, that, she's sorry he's hurt. And they kind of go on having, this discussion about the state of their relationship, whether or not they're going to continue to see one another. And then he does something which I think we're all kind of gearing up to see if the murder is captured on video, which we learned that it is. But what we're kind of unprepared for at first is Brandon hits her. He hits her across the face, and he hits her very hard, and he hits her very loud. And she really doesn't say anything to him about it. But she basically tells him that she's ready to go home, that she's not sure if they will see each other again, that she will maybe leave that up to him. And at that moment, she kind of looks away, and Brandon takes the opportunity to pick up the knife, and he grabs her by the back of the head, and he cuts her throat. She fights for her life. She really does. You see her physically struggle, but she is tall, she's thin, and Brandon is, without a doubt, bigger and has the ability to overpower her, which he does. And he pins her down to the back seat, and he's yelling at her. He's blaming Bianca, saying, "You made me do this. Why did you make me do this?" And what most people don't know, they know that there's a video of the homicide, but what they don't know is that he then retrieves the cell phone from the front vent clip, and he brings it to the back seat, and he presses record, and he videotapes very closely what I would presume would be Bianca's absolute last breaths. As she lays dying in the back seat, he's telling her to close her eyes and that she's going to go to sleep. And he films the entirety of that, and you hear her struggling to breathe, and ultimately she succumbs to that wound to her throat.
From talking to all the people that involved in it, I know how damaging and devastating watching that video has been to them. I don't know how many nights I haven't slept because of that video. It's just a very disturbing video. Very disturbing.
Detectives are informed that the murder video is circulating the internet and rush to get it taken down.
The amount of misinformation that was put out there through the internet was definitely a challenge to keep up with, because once the wrong information gets out there, it can take a life of its own.
With huge concern amongst Utica police that the graphic video of 17-year-old Bianca Devin's murder, filmed by her killer Brandon Clark, is being distributed online, officers attempt to control what is being shared and posted from the tragedy that night.
One of the big things right from the beginning was trying to dispel a lot of the rumors that were circulating in social media, was that there was a video of the murder. We knew that there was a video of the murder, but we had no evidence that that video had been published anywhere. We know that it wasn't released through his phone. We were able to locate that video, and it was clearly not the video that was related to this case. It was kind of a prank video that somebody took and said that it was a video of this crime, which depicted the two people that were similar in description to Brandon and Bianca, but it clearly was not the video, and we knew that for sure because we had the video. The video was kept under wraps, and we did not release any of that information to the media.
On the internet, someone's posted this text message conversation supposedly between the two of them. I know that's not true. It's a fake post. So I try very much to not get lost in the outside world, but only what we've extracted and put together between the two of them.
Investigators visit the hospital to interview Brandon Clark, who is unhelpful, and realize he is loving the notoriety.
One of our officers that was on guard at the hospital observed him get angry that he had missed a newscast related to this case. It was something he was interested in seeing. And as we learned throughout this case that this case was all about Brandon, and he wanted to blame Bianca for what he had done.
So why would you want to shake hands with the killer?
Well, Brandon, I'll tell you what. It's okay, take your time. You can ask me and I can ask you, but so you would like to talk to me then? Yes? Yes? No? I have to get through this and then we can have a full conversation.
Brandon declined at that point to talk to him, which is his constitutional right to not talk to the police and incriminate himself. So at that point, Investigator Palladino ceased any conversation and left the hospital.
Officers received the arrest warrant, and Brandon Clark is formally charged.
Here in New York State, we don't have a requirement of premeditated murder, but planning certainly helps to show intent. We have murder in the second degree, which is intentional murder.
Bianca's death has a huge impact on the community.
Her family put out some pink ribbons in the area of the Utica that they live. You could go through that neighborhood and you knew that this is where she grew up. And I think it gave everybody some solace to know that people were thinking of Bianca.
There were 2 vigils that were held. A lot of her friends were there. They had candles and they remembered her and they had photos of her.
It was attended by a large number of people in the community that knew her and knew her family and really wanted to show support. The crime scene itself, the city actually had to barricade, dead end, because people kept going down there at the scene where she was killed.
Her mother set up a scholarship fund in Bianca's name and also an art show because Bianca was a wonderful artist. She loved to draw. And this was in her memory, and her mother had displayed many of her drawings around her house.
So I would say Bianca will live on in this community, and certainly her memory will.
While preparing for trial, investigators come across even more crucial information on Brandon's phone.
The cell phone really kind of becomes a treasure trove for us when it shows his intent to kill her. We learn that he kind of meets her in May over Instagram and that he begins to search her and her different internet handles on various different platforms. And then he also begins to search different things like how to conceal a camera in a car, hanging, by which has some evidentiary value to us or significance to us because we find a rope at the scene. As we are pulling more data off of this phone, we see that he has done internet searches for months, and then as we're getting closer to the date of the homicide, weeks and days leading up to it, his searches begin to get a little bit more narrow. And those searches are specifically for how to render a person unconscious, various types of chokeholds, as well as the carotid artery. One of the things that supporters of Brandon have said was that he's always intended to commit suicide and that he didn't intend to hurt Bianca at all. But for us, the evidence speaks to the alternative because the searches are how to render another person unconscious, not himself, how to choke out another person to incapacitate them. So that would be kind of what I would say to those folks is this was very directed at causing harm, not only to somebody else, but specifically to Bianca.
With all the evidence collated, police start centering on the motive for the killing. They determine that jealousy is key to the case.
This jealousy boils over to a point of physical abuse, verbal abuse, and then murder.
One of the things we did was we obtained search warrants for his various accounts for Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, Discord. We were able to see the first one I believe that went out was the one on Discord. And it was that initial picture of her body, which had caught so much attention, that ultimately kind of initiated those 2, I would call them Good Samaritans in Tennessee and Utah, to call 911. And it said, now you're going to have to find somebody else to orbit.
We then learn that an orbiter is an individual who provides another individual immense amount of attention, be it be gifts, money, or just simply accolades online that that individual who is seeking that attention has this group of followers called orbiters around them in their online persona.
And that was something that Brandon did not like, and ultimately was telling them to they won't be able to orbit around her anymore.
A lot has been made about Discord and Instagram, but in our eyes, even from the beginning, those things were evidence. But our theme was that this was really truly Brandon is a domestic abuser that killed what he thought was his significant other because she didn't want to be with him.
In the pre-court session, Brandon Clark enters a not guilty plea, and it is apparent he wants to shift responsibility for his actions.
There were secondary sources, online vloggers and things of that nature, who got to Brandon, who said how famous he could be and that it wasn't his fault. And I think he interpreted that he could remain in the public eye if he withdrew his guilty plea, but certainly was never about remorse and the fact that he did something wrong. It was just about how can I maintain my sense of public image that Brandon Clark wished so desperately to have.
On February the 10th, 2020, just weeks before he is due to stand trial, Brandon Clark changes his plea.
Brandon was sentenced to 25 to life per our agreement, that he receives no plea bargain in this case because the crime he committed and the way he committed it deserves no leniency in any regard. The maximum is what he deserves, and that's exactly what he got. So he will be spending the next 25 years to life in a New York State prison.
It is devastating for the e-girl internet community of thousands of followers.
If one thing this case really people could take away from him, it's the importance of letting our children know how dangerous it is to put yourself out there into the internet world where you do not know who's looking at you and what they're doing and what their motivation is with what you're putting out there.
I can't think of another case that we've handled in this office where the family is constantly subjected to a barrage of, if they go on the internet, of seeing these images again. No other victim's family, in my experience, has had to deal with that situation. So it's different, and I feel for them because they're dealing with a whole new situation than most victims' families have to deal with. Picture their loved one's murder being in cyberspace for ever, I guess. I don't think it's ever going to be possible to find them all and get them all down. So I do feel for them in that respect.
The victim's family wants one thing back that nobody can give them, and that's their loved one. And that's the hardest part. You hold the vigils, you do all those things, the scholarships, but the one thing they want back is their child.
September 15th, 2009. Police are called to an incident at Coral Gables High School, south of Miami, Florida.
It's not every day that somebody's dying in a high school, especially at Coral Gables Senior.
This was something that resonated with the entire county, that a homicide would take place on the grounds of the school in the middle of classes.
On arrival, police are presented with a vicious and bloody crime scene.
To actually stab somebody and get the feeling of that thing going through somebody as they're dying literally and bleeding out, it's a very violent attack. Well, he did that 5 times.
To stab somebody 5 times, you got to be mad at him.
Investigators quickly identify a suspect, but were struggling to understand their motive.
Race, ethnicity, social, economic background had nothing to do with this. This was as simple as a young kid who didn't know how to act or how to deal with his feelings, who decided that the best way to go about it was to put a knife in his pocket that day and start a fight.
This is the story of Andy Rodriguez and how a simple friendship drove him to change from a student with his life ahead of him into a cold-blooded killer. It's the morning of September 15th, 2009. Police receive a 911 call from Coral Gables High School.
I had just left the office and I was en route to do something in one of my cases when I got a telephone call from Sergeant Brassey. He asked me to respond to Coral Gables Sr.
I was driving south on Segovia Street when the call went out. I started going towards the call, which was a fight in progress. Later, they put it out that somebody had been stabbed.
I arrived at the scene shortly after 10 in the morning at Coral Gables Sr.
When the police first arrive, they are confronted with a chaotic scene.
I remember just trying to navigate through all the cars that were there and the presence of media on the scene. I remember students on the outside of the school. I remember parents, what appeared to me, possibly trying to pick up their kids or trying to locate their kids.
Parents had been called. We know that parents had responded to the school in an attempt to contact their children.
This is very much out of keeping for the quiet, well-to-do part of town.
Coral Gables is very nice, very diverse with people. It's kind of more of a middle to higher income families.
It's sort of like the Beverly Hills of Miami-Dade County. So when you say, oh, I live in Coral Gables, it's like, you're very fancy. You're like, whoa, But, there are areas that are, a little more humble. There's a lot of apartment buildings and sort of young families. Like Miami, the movers and shakers in Coral Gables are generally Cuban Americans, people whose families have been here now for a few generations and have really made their money and their wealth as doctors, lawyers, developers, people who are ingrained in the power structure of the county.
Crime is, you get your typical kind of car burglaries, kind of thefts, but nothing really, major happens there.
And in the heart of this historic town is the equally historic high school.
Coral Gables Senior High School is one of a handful of very well-known, important legacy high schools in Dade County. A lot of famous people have gone to school there, a lot of, just a lot of the community. It's an old school, so there's a lot of people who have gone through there. Members of Congress went there. Janet Reno went there, former Attorney General of the United States of America. This is a place that, people know locally.
Having made their way through the gathering crowds, detectives head for the crime scene to begin a full investigation into what has happened at Coral Gables High School.
I walked into the school. I remember it was a courtyard area inside the school.
The positioning of the body that I recall was that the victim was found face down on the concrete floor. And by this point, I had learned that it was a stabbing and that we did know that the victim had been stabbed multiple times. At the time, it was early in the morning, so the student activity was cordoned off from that location, with the exception of people who may have witnessed the incident. And of course, they were removed from the scene and isolated or relocated to an area where detectives could speak with them.
There was a number of students that needed to be interviewed. They had all been separated, and they were in different parts of the school, mostly in the office area, but they were all separated in different rooms, so they can't tarnish each other's perspectives or what they witnessed on the case. They don't speak to each other. So I methodically just started going one by one. I talked to each student. I did interviews, and ultimately I took formal statements of them, each one.
As detectives are interviewing the witnesses, a clearer picture of what happened begins to emerge.
They all had their different twists, but they were all consistent in that these were all students that are walking through the hallways between classes. And, you can go back to the days when you were in school, how chaotic the hallways were sometimes. Not in a bad way, just people screaming, people meeting, people socializing. So people's perspectives are going to be very different, and what they witnessed is going to be very different. So I got a lot of different versions of, I was walking through the hallway, I was going to my next class, I heard a commotion. I turned. I see two students fighting, and I see one of them collapse to the floor. I saw blood coming from his chest, or I saw blood coming from his back. So it was a variation of that story from different perspectives of the students who were walking through. Some of the kids, I remember one in particular that requested to have one of his parents present during the interview, which of course we agreed to. The other ones were somewhat shaken up. You can see visibly they were very shaken up.
The students were really, really affected by it. I remember the testimony of several of the witness students afterwards, how they still carried this very traumatic incident that they saw unfold in front of them in the hallway of a school, how it traumatized their life.
And a couple of them were, pretty matter of fact. So some of these kids they'll surprise you sometimes with the way they react to things.
While the crime scene investigators are conducting their portion of the investigation, I'm looking at the crime scene, I'm looking at the victim just to document what he or she might be wearing. I will go discuss investigations with the crime scene investigators on the scene. Did you see anything unusual? Did you notice any type of defense wounds on the victim? Something that I may have missed. I recall seeing that the victim did have some defense cuts on his hands, and I do remember seeing stab wounds to the victim's chest. In addition to the stab wounds, I saw trauma to the face, and just at that particular time attributed it to the victim falling face first on the ground.
Investigators are gathering a lot of evidence, but are still missing some crucial information.
Most unfortunately, what caught everybody's attention to the fight in the first place was the noise and the commotion. By that time, the fight's already started, so nobody was really able to tell us at what point it started or who started it, only that a fight had started and that it ended the way it did. That was what was consistent. What we couldn't get at that point was the motive for the fight, because everybody's attention was called because of the commotion or the noise once the fight had already started. Another thing that was consistent was that no words were exchanged during the fight. Nobody reported that the victim said anything. Nobody reported that the subject said anything. It was just, by the time their attention was drawn to the fight, it was already the fight was already ongoing, and no words were exchanged.
Another breakthrough comes when they scan through the school's security tapes.
At some point, it becomes known to us that there's cameras at the school. Now it's actually normal for all schools to have cameras. Back then it wasn't so routine, but this school had cameras. So one of the things I was asked to do at the school was to review the footage and to get a copy of that tape. And we did. And from the tape, you don't see the whole fight, but you see part of the fight.
The security cameras were in the courtyard, and what they showed was a fight broke out in the hallway, and the fight then spilled out into the courtyard. And you do see a fight. It's very quick. It lasts maybe a minute. And you can then see him, there's cameras throughout the school, so you can then see him running through the hallways and is covering his head with his shirt. So clearly fleeing from the scene. You can see a girl who must be, 5 feet away from what's happening? And I think you can look at the facial features. I'm not sure she really registered what was happening right away.
With witnesses' statements and the security cameras footage, police quickly identify a suspect.
It appeared that the aggressor was going to be the subject. He ends up on top of the victim at one point. He ends up with an object in his hand. People report that the victim was bleeding profusely, that the victim at one point lost consciousness. And a couple of the students mentioned by first name. They didn't mention the name Andy. They don't know his last name. They've seen him around school. And that's when I made the decision, as I'm talking to these people, that let's get this guy's photograph real quick. So while I'm in the office, I asked the administration, can I get a yearbook from the year before? And I research his name, and I see the page that has his photo on it. So I made several copies of that album, and as I began speaking to the students, I started presenting that page from the yearbook that has multiple students on it, and I said, look at this page, tell me if you see anybody on that page that you recognize, and each one by one said, this guy right here, he's the one that got into the fight, this is the guy that had the object in his hand, and one by one they began to identify Andy Rodriguez as a person who fought the victim.
September 15th, 2009. Police are continuing at high speed in their investigation into the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
This is really a simple, straightforward case that doesn't reflect the nature of the crime that was committed.
This was the kind of case that is really a dumb high school fight that probably happens a gazillion times every single day across the country.
It's becoming clear that the prime suspect for the killing is student Andy Rodriguez.
A couple of the students I interviewed saw an object in Andy Rodriguez's hand, and that they saw severe injuries to the victim's chest or back area where he was bleeding profusely. Ultimately, he lost balance and he fell face first on the ground.
A quiet teenager, investigators learn Rodriguez spent little of his social time outside of his girlfriend, Daimilce Salgado.
In that summer of 2009, Daimilce Salgado was going out with Andy Rodriguez. They were steady, so to speak. During that time, Andy had become very jealous of Daimilce's, not knowing whether or not she was speaking to other boys at the time.
Apparently, Andy and Daimilce had actually broken up, and the reason was that he had wanted her MySpace password, and she didn't want to give it to him, right? And so it was this, this friction point between them that sort of set the tone for this possessiveness that Andy had over her.
That breakup takes them into the new school year, but they get back together in the first 2 weeks of school.
Similarly quiet was the life of Juan Carlos Rivera, who had recently moved to Miami from Cuba.
Juan Carlos Rivera was a young man of a Cuban family. His parents were both doctors in Cuba. His parents were divorced. His father then moved to Spain, where he was practicing in Spain. When Juan Carlos came of age for Cuban military, his mother decided she wasn't interested in having him partake in that and was looking for a suitable alternative to that. That suitable alternative for them was for him to move to Spain with his father. He spent some time in Spain with his father and didn't really take kindly to the life in Spain. And at that point in time, a family decision was made that he would move to Miami and live with his uncle and with his grandmother.
Juan's experience was very typical of what a lot of people who are coming from another country to Miami experience, because there's a huge difference culturally between the Cuban Americans who have been born here and whose families have been here for generations, and they all speak English, and they sort of have that Miami American, Cuban American culture, and the people who came within the last few years. So there's this huge culture divide, and even within the high school students. You get a lot of Cuban American kids who kind of look down on the more recent arrivals, and they call them, and it's an offensive slang, but they call them refs, or they call them refie, right? Which is just slang for a refugee, right? And it's a way, and every immigrant group historically has had sort of these culture clashes with the people who have been here for a while, and they're just fresh off the boat kind of thing. And Juan sort of fit that bill, right? He's someone who just came over. He was someone that sort of was this sad kind of figure trying to make his way into this whole new society, and societies within societies, right? High school, this is, you have your different cliques and your different power structures even within a school, let alone within a whole community.
Juan Carlos is now living with his uncle and grandmother in the same apartment block as Daimilce Salgado.
So in this area of Coral Gables, he was living in a 2-story apartment building, much like the very old style where the doors face out. And he would see Daimilce Salgado. They never really spoke to each other, but they saw each other and they knew of each other from seeing each other in the apartment complex. On the first day of school, Juan Carlos went to the bus stop where he was going to take the Metro bus, public transportation, to school, because he had no other way of getting to school because of the socioeconomic conditions that he was living in at that point in time.
It's not a comfortable experience to take public transportation in Miami, and it instantly marks you as someone that doesn't have the means. We're in Miami, whether we actually have the means or not, a lot of it is about image, right? It's about, I can have my nice car to get me from, Kendall to, South Beach. And so if you don't have a car and you're taking public transportation, especially in a place that can be as starkly divided and judgy as Coral Gables, you're the kid taking the bus to school, you're lower class in the eyes of many.
She saw him there wearing his red shirt his Coral Gables High School shirt, and she pulled over. And she rolled down the window and asked him if he needed a ride to school, having seen him around the complex before. And he, of course, took that opportunity to go take a ride with Diomedes. One, she was an attractive young lady, and two, he needed a ride to school and he didn't want to ride the Metro bus.
The previously sweet relationship takes a nasty turn when the green-eyed monster is revealed within Rodriguez.
Andy has seen that Diomedes and Juan Carlos Rivera are arriving at school together for those first 2 weeks. He's not appreciative of this, and now that they're back together, he has asked her to stop. And she does. She stops giving Juan Carlos a ride to school. But she doesn't stop speaking to Juan Carlos. So when she sees him inside the cafeteria, they're nice to each other, they speak to each other, they have conversation. And again, these are more issues of jealousy for Andy Rodriguez. There was never any conversation, and there was never a statement given by anybody that showed that Juan Carlos Rivera had any romantic intentions towards Diomedes Salgado.
Investigators are beginning to understand the motive behind the attack and start a manhunt for Andy Rodriguez, who is on the run.
Students initially say he ran across the street from the school, and then residents from that neighborhood called the police and reported seeing a young white male running through the front yards of the residences and gave a description of the clothing, which matched the description of the clothing of the student who fled the scene, and units responded to the area.
I was training somebody, we were just driving, we heard the call go out, so we said, we started heading toward that direction. As the information kept coming over the radio, we heard that he was running across to Riviera. As soon as we turned onto Riviera, we saw a young, male running through the front yards of that street. Officer Bueno then kind of approached him and kind of cut him off, and he ended up in somebody's yard. We exited the vehicle, and Officer Bueno gave him commands to get on the ground, put his hands behind his back. He then went up to him, handcuffed him, and searched him, at which time he did find the knife. He then gave it to me. I secured it into a container to preserve it, and then we put him in the back of my car at that time.
Investigators now start pulling background checks and information on Andy Rodriguez.
So when Andy Rodriguez was brought into the Dade County Jail, the public defender said that he had never been arrested, he had no prior record, which was true. He had no prior criminal record. But at his school, he did have a fairly lengthy disciplinary record. I think there were 7 instances of discipline having been levied against him. So he clearly had some issues at the school and definitely was someone who had been known to have issues there.
September 15th, 2009. Police investigating the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera quickly apprehend their number one suspect, Andy Rodriguez.
It's right before noon, so it's been almost 4 hours since the actual murder has taken place.
From beginning to end, it really is open and shut in a number of hours.
With Andy in custody, investigators have to start the delicate task of interviewing him with the hope of securing a confession.
My wheels are turning. I have to be on point. I want to make sure I do a good job translating. I could ruin the interview. I could ruin a case by not translating correctly, by handling something improperly. So I'm getting myself ready for the long haul. I know it's going to be probably a long interview. I'm going to be in there for a while, and I want to make sure my head's on straight. The subject's already in custody. He's in one of the interview rooms waiting to be interviewed. I remember walking in, and I was struck by how young he looked. You handle these cases, and over the years, you're used to dealing with certain segment of the population, more rugged. A lot of times, the drug dealers or the, people that aren't the law-abiding citizens in our society. But you walk into this one, it's a kid, it's a student. This kid should have been in class at that time. He should have been maybe at lunch, but he's sitting here in an interview room in the Homicide Bureau because we believe he killed somebody, so we need to find out what happened. We go in, and he begins to tell us a story of what occurred. And he tells us that the day before, he was walking in the hallways of Coral Gables Senior when he accidentally bumped into the victim while walking to class.
Yo iba para la clase.
I was walking to my class.
Y él iba para la suya, me imagino.
And I imagine he was going to his class.
Cuando fui entrando al pasillo, él iba saliendo.
When I was entering the hallway, he was exiting.
Chocamos.
And we bumped into each other.
And that he told the victim something along the lines of, hey, watch out or be careful. And the victim kind of stared him down.
When he bumped into you yesterday, did you say anything to him?
Cuando él chocó con usted ayer, ¿usted le dijo algo a él?
Yes.
Yes.
What did you say?
¿Qué le dijo?
Ten cuidado.
Be careful.
Did you mean that in a threat in any way?
¿Usted lo dijo de una manera como amenazándolo?
No. What's up?
I said it normal.
Then the day of the murder, September 15th, he says, again, they're exchanging classes, and he was on his way to weightlifting class, when he says that he's about to pass the victim in the hallway, and he observes the victim kind of stick his elbow out, like to kind of bump him a little bit. So he, in return, also sticks his elbow out and bumps the victim. And at this time, he says the victim squared off to him, and the fight ensued. But at some point during the fight, the way he describes it is that he ends up in a disadvantage because the victim somehow ends up behind him, choking him out. And it's at this point that he feels the only way he's going to be able to save himself is to reach into his pocket and pull out a knife that he found a couple days earlier when he got off the bus. And he takes that knife and somehow, in the frenzy, ends up stabbing the victim one time, is able to break free. And at this point, he runs from the area because he doesn't know the victim's going to continue hurting him. And he runs through the residential area where he's eventually located by police, and that's where he surrenders.
He gives a statement where he believes that this was self-defense, that he believed Juan Carlos Rivera was going to do something to him at some point. Honestly, I think it was just an explanation that Andy Rodriguez gave that really had no merit. But at that point in time, he really just needed to give himself an out for what he'd done.
The way he described it, it was literally just bumping into each other the day before, bumping into each other the day of, and escalating into a fight. And he says he never had problems with the victim before, never knew the victim.
Mr. Rodriguez is very clear. He says, I didn't even know the guy. Didn't even know his name.
The person you had the fight at school with today,
La persona con la que tuvo la pelea en colegio hoy.
Do you know his name?
¿Usted sabe su nombre? No.
While Andy Rodriguez is giving his version of events, other witnesses are telling investigators the whole story that unfolded over the previous few days.
There's multiple detectives that are doing multiple interviews while you're interviewing the subject. So you're constantly getting information in. And every time you take a break, there's a detective or somebody updating you on something else that they learned. And now we're learning that people have already interviewed the subject's girlfriend and other students at the school who are now describing, hold on a second, this isn't a bumping kind of thing.
In the time before the homicide, Andy will see Juan Carlos in the hall on a number of occasions. And during those occasions, he will attempt to intimidate Juan Carlos. He'll bump him. He'll say things to him in the hallway. On September 14th of 2009, the day before the homicide, he'll actually tell him to be careful and to watch out for himself.
In fact, we're now learning from additional interviews as the day goes on that some of Andy Rodriguez's friends had already confronted Juan Rivera days and weeks prior and had words with him. Basically, they were almost like bullying him because they knew that Andy was jealous because his girlfriend was giving the victim rides to school, and that was creating problems between them. And that's the reason why Andy didn't like Juan Carlos Rivera.
In that intervening week prior to the murder, Juan Carlos Rivera sees Diomedes Salgado at school often, and they converse, and they're congenial with one another. But Andy Rodriguez becomes increasingly jealous. He purchases a knife. The knife is a stiletto-type knife where the blade is in the handle and it ejects when a button is pressed.
There were a lot of questions as to where the knife came from. The girlfriend claimed that they had purchased it at a flea market, and the idea was that he worked at another flea market so that he needed it for his job when he was breaking down boxes. Rodriguez claims the knife came from, he found it walking home from school one day and just saw a knife and just kept it.
He says that the morning of the murder, that he put it in his pocket in the event that he had any problems with the victim because they had bumped into each other in the hallway the day before. To me, it was very evident, whether he realized it or not, that the jealousy that he had was brewing to a point where he wanted something to happen. He was waiting for that confrontation to happen, and he was going to make it happen on September 15th.
What is clear, both from the visual evidence we have from the surveillance footage and then from the eyewitnesses who testified in open court, that Mr. Rivera was fighting for his life. And you can see this, and he was stabbed 5 times. And as a matter of fact, was fighting up till the point when the assailant ran away, and then he collapsed and passed away soon thereafter.
So now we get this information. We want to find out what Andy Rodriguez has to say about this now. So we go back in there now and we confront him with these newfound facts. So there's new information we're getting, and we ask him about it. Andy Rodriguez says, you know what? Yeah, it's true. I didn't want to tell you anything because I didn't want to get my girlfriend involved in what happened. But let me explain to you what happened. And he begins to tell us basically the same story. And he tells us that he was dating his girlfriend, and that at some point on the first day of school, he saw his girlfriend driving the victim to school. Well, he ain't like that. Even though he reports he wasn't jealous.
The incident that happened yesterday and today with you and him did not have anything to do with your girlfriend.
El incidente que pasó ayer y hoy no tuvo nada que ver con tu novia.
No, temprano. La bomba se lo dejó la cosa pasó hoy. Any jealousy on your part?
¿Estabas celoso?
No. ¿Estás loco?
No, are you crazy? I'm not gonna be jealous.
No.
In a young 17-year-old's mind, he may not even realize he was jealous. He felt uncomfortable with it, or he didn't like the fact that she was driving another boy to school. And he kept bottling it up, and he kept dealing with it the way he did, and then ended up all, obviously, erupting the way it did.
Andy told a number of lies in that statement. He told so many that it was really easy for us as prosecutors to call him out on those, and to make a jury see that anything that he had said in that statement really was to just get himself out of trouble.
When the interview comes to an end, police are sure that they have the murderer and his motive for doing so.
At the end of the day, Andy Rodriguez killed Juan Carlos Rivera over a jealous rage that he had over a relationship that he believed Juan Carlos was having with his girlfriend at the time, Dalmasis Salgado, which never actually existed.
It was something that seemed so teenage, and yet it escalated into this, knife in someone's heart, and this lost life, and these lives that were shattered. And that was the really tragic thing.
The French, they couldn't give a lot of detail, but they knew that the issue stemmed from Andy Rodriguez not liking the victim because of the rides to school and the relationship that he had, or Andy thought he had, with his girlfriend. So it was definitely over jealousy issues. They just didn't know how to put it into words sometimes, and they'll tell you a 1 hour story, and at the end of the day, when you look at the stories, he was jealous, and that's all it came down to.
This wasn't a whodunit. This wasn't a case where we had to figure out, did he really do it? Did he have an alibi? It wasn't like these traditional murder mysteries that we all see on TV and in the news. It really boiled down to that raw human emotion of jealousy, of insecurity, of disrespect, these sort of things that pop up when we're young that we often that usually just get settled in fights or arguments or a fist fight at worst, but very rarely escalate into this very public killing.
From this point on, later that afternoon, Andy Rodriguez was booked and charged with murder after conferring with the state attorney's office. And now the case continues as far as continuing to do interviews. More students come forth after the fact. We were able to watch the news that night like everybody else, and we see students being interviewed by the media. Those are students we have to track down now because we know of them initially, and we want to see what their story is or what they witnessed the day of. So now that's got to take days. Sometimes it takes weeks and months to track all these people down. You want to do interviews with them. Some people actually didn't see anything. You find out a lot of these people that come on the news, they lie, or they embellish, or they exaggerate what they saw because they just want to come on the news. But some actually do have value to what they witnessed. And those people we want to bring in, and we're going to do the same thing we did with the other students. The day of, we're going to take a formal statement from them, and they become witnesses in the case. And all that information, eventually what it does is it creates a puzzle, because everybody has a different perspective of what they saw, and it fills in little gaps of the story that maybe somebody else didn't see. So that's why all these interviews are super important for us.
Detectives have one last big thing to do with the case.
The autopsy for us was very important because the autopsy tells you the story forensically and with the evidence what actually happened. People can describe a punch, people can describe what appears to be a stab wound or a plunge with a knife, but until you see the actual injuries on a human being, that doesn't lie. And that doesn't leave anything up for interpretation. It's clear. A stab wound's a stab wound. A bullet hole's a bullet hole. And in this case, we knew exactly where the stab wounds were located, which supported even more the fact that Andy Rodriguez was the aggressor and that Andy Rodriguez 100% had the upper hand in this fight, ultimately killing Juan Rivera. There was a total of 5 stab wounds. 3 were to the chest, 2 to the back. The ones that the victim suffered to the back, the way that Andy Rodriguez described, it would have been impossible for him to have done those stab wounds unless the victim would have been choking him from behind. He would have reached behind the victim somehow and been able to inflict those stab wounds. It's physically impossible. And that was one of the first things that we noticed in the autopsy that refuted or was inconsistent with what he said to us during the interview, proving even more so how aggressive and how violent the attack was and what his mindset was when he confronted Juan Rivera at the school on September 15th. That basically ends there because there's really no follow-up anymore in this case. It's wrapped up in a couple days because we have the subject in custody, we have the murder weapon in our possession, we have sworn statements from everybody that account for the fighting and the background of what transpired and what led to the fight, and now we have the medical examiner's findings of exactly what the injuries are to the victim, which nobody can dispute anymore. You know, you can't say I stabbed him one time when the victim has 5 stab wounds, or you can't argue about where you stabbed the victim when we have the evidence right there in front of us.
September 2009, Miami-Dade County Police are close to closing the investigation into the senseless murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
From the time that the homicide took place to the time that the interviews took place, it really wasn't a lot of time.
He was just a young kid who's like trying to come up in the world and like, you know, fit into this new, very, very have and have not society. And this is what happened.
Before investigators can go to trial, they have to gather all the evidence they have against the suspect, Andy Rodriguez.
So up to this point, we have student interviews that we did that witnessed the fight. We have students who saw Andy Rodriguez with an object in his hand and they see the victim bleeding profusely and falling to the ground. We have people who see him fleeing the school in a residential area, later on apprehended by Coral Gables PD. We have the murder weapon found on the victim with the victim's blood. We also have the victim's blood on Andy Rodriguez's clothing when he's taken into custody. And now we have Andy Rodriguez's own admission that he was involved in a fight, that he indeed inflicted these fatal wounds to the victim. He minimizes and he says, oh, I only stabbed him one time. He tries to get around it. He tries to explain it in a way where he looks like the victim. But the evidence is overwhelming, especially once we go into the autopsy now. And now we see, well, it wasn't 1 stab wound. It was 5 stab wounds. And 3 were to the chest and 2 to the back that were impossible by the account that he gives us. That's more than enough evidence that we need. It's overwhelming evidence at this point for the prosecution to be able to go forth and try this case in a court of law.
The trial very quickly becomes a courtroom drama.
The defense attorney is a very animated, very aggressive, his name is Alex Michaels, very good defense lawyer.
He's like this Romanian guy with this very thick accent, and you know, he always likes to needle people and go over the top with his arguments. So it becomes like there's a lot of tension in there because he's like sort of grading the judge and grading the prosecutors and, you know, attacking the witnesses on the stand and, you know, through cross-examination. So it kind of just, there's like this tension that builds up throughout the whole thing.
The defense attorney, Alex Michaels, he began with a defense of self-defense, stating that Juan Carlos allegedly threatening Andy Rodriguez over this friendship and that he had with Damises Salgado. And then it progressed into Andy needing to defend himself because these elbowings in the hallway were really the product of Juan Carlos, as opposed to the truth, which was that they were actually because of Andy.
The defense didn't have a lot of cards to play in this case. I mean, you know, when the murder happens on camera and there are eyewitnesses, there's not a whole lot of cards you can play. So you've got to probably come up with some unique legal arguments to try to work on.
He came after us, and I think part of it was the evidence was overwhelming. And at this point, he's got to find some angle to try to explain why his client did what he did. A distraction, maybe. I don't know what you want to call it. They do that sometimes. They want to distract the jury. And obviously, you know, the facts spoke for themselves.
The opening statement was one that's very factual. It takes you through the events that happened that day, but more importantly lays out the foundation for why Andy would want to have this argument with Juan Carlos and ultimately murder him.
The crux of the case was not whether or not Mr. Rodriguez did this conduct. It was whether or not it was murder or whether or not it was in self-defense.
It wasn't self-defense because Andy had it in for Juan Carlos Rivera from the day that he met Juan Carlos Rivera. He knew that Juan Carlos Rivera was a possible interest for his girlfriend, and that set him off from the beginning. He didn't even want to see Juan Carlos Rivera anywhere near his girlfriend, and he would do anything to make sure that that never happened. When a defendant gives a lie like that it was self-defense to detectives, it kind of pigeonholes the defense into what they're going to tell the jury happened, because they can't really go with another defense. So in that way, Andy had already set up the defense or the failed defense for the trial way back when he was interviewed by detectives.
At the end of the day, when you have a case where the facts speak for themselves and it's so overwhelmingly against the defense has only a couple options left: to attack your integrity or attack your procedures. And that's what they do every single time.
The jury don't take long to convict Andy Rodriguez of the murder.
The trial was fairly cut and dry. The jury agreed. They took less than a day to convict him. They convicted him of second-degree murder.
It's a fairly quick deliberation. It really only took a couple of hours. I think they strongly took to heart everything that we said. They did consider probably the self-defense for a moment, but really paid it no mind at the end of the day, where he was found guilty within a couple of hours.
It was one of those that I thought would get played out to some reasonable numbers, but the strategy for the defense was to go to trial. My opinion is that he thought maybe that he would get sympathy from the jury because he was a young kid. You just got to find that one person on the jury who says, I can't put this kid away for a long time. He's a young kid. But it was a very vicious attack and unnecessary, and I think that's what doomed him.
When it was all said and done, there was some speculation initially that he might be charged with first-degree murder. That did not happen. He was charged with second-degree murder, and the prosecutors were pushing for a lifetime in prison.
November 2011, Andy Rodriguez is sentenced for the murder of Juan Carlos Rivera.
The judge then had discretion as to the sentencing. The prosecutors wanted life in prison. They did not get it. The judge handed down a sentence of 40 years in prison and then 10 years of probation after he's released. That means that Mr. Rodriguez won't come out of jail until he's at least 51 years old. In the state of Florida, there's a law that says you have to serve at least 85% of your sentence, which means he won't come out until he's at least 51, and then he'll be under probation until he's at least 61. And the judge said that, Mr. Rodriguez, because of your actions, you have forfeited your youth and most of your life. And that's what happened to him.
I think the jury got it right. Yeah, I think the jury got it right. And I think the judge got it right. You know, Andy, if he serves the 85% of his sentence and all of that, he should get out in his early 50s. That's, a significant amount of time behind bars. The world will be completely different than when he got in there. I think the jury got it right.
In this case, because of the evidence that was so obvious, it seems like justice was done. And the real tragedy here was the senseless loss of life on both sides. And the prosecutor, Catherine Fernandez-Rundle, said after the judgment, after the sentencing, she said that the real tragedy here is not just for the Rivera family, but also for the Rodriguez family, that 2 lives were lost here. Yes, he took a life. Yes, that's, depending on your faith belief, it's a mortal sin, it's a irredeemable act, whatever it is. Sure, that's true. But he has to live with it in this life for the rest of his life.
With the murderer Andy Rodriguez behind bars, the victim's family have to try and put some sense back into their lives.
There's no winners in this. Your loved one isn't coming back. So when I say that you bring them a little bit of closure, a lot of people exaggerate it. Well, now at least they have... There's never going to be closure for that family. They're going to miss their loved one every second for the rest of their lives. But at least legally, They don't have to worry about that person being out free. They don't have to worry about that person hurting anybody else. That part of it they can put to the side, and they can now, what I consider will be, and I'm not a psychologist, they can finish the grieving process now.
The victim's family, the subject's family, anyone closely associated never forgets about a human tragedy like this. And really, it was a human tragedy.
And then they'll stay in contact with you for years. And one day, it just stops. And that to me tells me that they're at a place at least where they don't need to hear my voice anymore. They don't need to hear the reinforcement from me that everything's fine, that he's still in prison, he's not getting out, there's no appeals, and it's a process they go through.
The tragedy of this whole incident is the lack of change within society.
I don't think it changed anything. I honestly don't. It's unfortunate, but I don't think it changed much. These are still young people. They're still going to have passions. They're still going to be immature. And crimes like these, unfortunately, will continue to occur.
People will always be hotheads. Kids will always be hotheads. I don't know, maybe I'm pessimistic about the human condition. And I tend to think that these things will always happen. But, you know, fights like this and disrespect and that sort of, you know, the macho bumping of the elbows and why are you looking at me bad? I mean, I don't know. I've been covering it since I got here 20 years ago, and I think I'll always cover it. And the settings just kind of change and the dynamics change.
A lot of these young people don't process the way we did maybe when I was younger. They're processing things differently now, and many times it's erupting in a violent, cathartic way for them maybe. But, you know, unfortunately, whether it's a knife or a gun or, you know, the fist fights, you don't hear about fist fights anymore. It's all involving weapons now. It's either got to be a knife or a gun, and then ends up, you know, ending people's lives. You end up killing people. And, you know, I think we need to be more involved as far as reporting things and you know, and diffusing situations.
December 1994, Catasauqua, Pennsylvania. A woman and her infant son are reported missing.
He called the police and he said, something is wrong. His wife is missing.
Their disappearance sends shock throughout the community.
Everyone is easily able to identify with a situation like this and kind of put their own family in their shoes.
There was some worry that she had been kidnapped or killed and that there was a killer out there. So there was some fear in the community.
4 months later, and their bodies are discovered in rural woodlands, brutally murdered.
The cause of death for Joanna was a gunshot to the face, to her head. And they could tell that it was a .22 caliber bullet.
When the police finally identify the suspected killer, they deny all knowledge.
She professed her innocence, and she made the case that she had done good things in life.
The fact that she had lied about owning a gun, the fact that she had no alibi that stood up.
This is the heart-wrenching story of Joanne and Alex Katranak, their terrifying disappearance, and what fueled their killer to commit such a murder.
The jealousy was so great that this became the motive for murder.
Catasauqua is a picturesque city and historic steel town in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania.
Catasauqua is a diverse community. We have approximately 6,700 people. We're 1.3 square miles, and we're bordered by Lehigh Valley International Airport, the city of Allentown, Whitehall Township, and to the north, North Catasauqua Borough. We do have our share of crime, but not so much violent crime.
On December 15th, 1994, Andy Katranak arrives home to an empty house. Unexpectedly, his wife Joanne and baby are not there.
He came home, I believe he noticed that preparations had started for dinner. There was some chicken out, but she wasn't home. He thought she might have been home already, and she was not. He waited a little while, and I believe it was around 8:30, he started to get more and more concerned she wasn't home yet, and called his mother. She was actually supposed to meet his mother earlier in the day to go Christmas shopping. His mother said that Joanna had never shown up.
You can imagine what's going through this poor man's mind at the time. He works hard all day. He's been doing that for a while, working on some friend's home about 10 miles from home. In the days before cell phones, he hasn't been in touch with his wife or his baby, who is 4 months old, by the way, all day long. Gets home. She's supposed to be home. He knows that she's gone shopping. So at first he's thinking, maybe she was held up shopping. Things are not so startling to him at that time that he sits down. I believe he has a beer. Maybe he looks at the paper. But then he starts getting worried, and he starts going through the house. And he goes down to the basement, and he sees this basement door, this old basement door that they never use, is ajar, and the hinge on it has been broken. Amazingly, though, he doesn't immediately think break-in, kidnapping. He thinks kids, teenagers. He doesn't think that someone has really done anything because he can't find anything amiss in his house. Nothing seems to be taken. Everything seems to be in its own place.
But as time passes, Andy grows concerned and contacts the police.
When Andy called the police about 10:30 that night, he reported that the back door down to a basement area had been left ajar or broken into.
I just talked to Allentown Police, and they told me to call you guys. I live in Caddy on Front Street. Okay. And my wife and my baby have been missing since like 2 o'clock this afternoon. And we just discovered that the downstairs basement door was jimmied open. And that's really got us worried now.
The trouble with police, no matter where they are, if they're in small town Americana or if they're in a large big city, there are so many incidents of missing persons that when a man calls, "Where is my wife? She was supposed to be with my mother-in-law to go shopping. It's now 10:30 at night and she is not home." Well, this is just another missing person. This is just another situation. The police generally do not get all that concerned.
Officers eventually respond to Andy Katranak's house to follow up on the call.
So an officer responded to that 911 call, went to the address on Front Street, and started his initial investigation. He discovered a hasp on one of the doors had been broken, and he also discovered some phone lines were cut.
With police starting their investigation, they receive a second call, this time from Joanne's sister.
It's now 3:30 a.m. in the morning, and Joanna still is not home. But her sister Peggy, who knows what's going on and knows that Joanna's not anywhere to be found, lives about 50 yards away from McCarthy's bar, and she sees Joanna's car, a tan Toyota, in the parking lot. There's nobody in the car. It's locked. They call the police.
LA County 911, do you have an emergency?
Yes, my sister Joanne Katranak has a missing persons out on her. We're at 740 Front Street, and we just located her car next door.
Next door?
Yeah, but she's not anywhere to be found still.
Joanne's sister does make the call to the police. Now we found Joanne's car, and amazingly, we found it in a place where she's never parked before. She had her usual parking spots. We're all creatures of habits, and hers, not unlikely, was right behind the house where they had a parking area. Also, the car was backed in, and Angie knew that Joanne had a phobia about backing her car. She would work as hard as she could to avoid having to put that car in reverse. So now they call the police, and the police are out here again at the car.
The police come to the scene. They get into the car. They find the seat has been pushed way up close to the driver's wheel. That doesn't make sense to anybody. It doesn't make sense to Peggy. It doesn't make sense to Andy. The police start to look in the car and they find blonde hairs that look that they're covered with blood. That doesn't make sense. There's a can of mace in the back seat of the car. And there's no baby paraphernalia. Wait a second. This is a mother who has a baby. There should be baby bags, diapers, bottles. Nothing's there.
I'd be looking at how many miles may have been put on that car since the time it was last filled. We'd do an investigation as to when the car was filled last. The hair from a dark-haired woman, why there would be light hair in that car would be a question to me. And why would there be mace in there?
Police start to suspect something sinister has happened and start examining Joanne's background and home life.
Common in missing persons cases, police will come out and take a report, but particularly with an adult, they're not going to be overly concerned right away. When they start to look into it, when they start to believe there's something more sinister going on, the people closest to the victim are usually very early on seen as suspects. And so it's not unusual to look at the husband, the boyfriend, or even an ex.
Well, the first thing they're going to look at is look at the family members. Find out what the relationship would be between the husband and wife, what the relationship is in the family, and find out if there are any issues. That's the first place to start. Joanne was 24 years old, had been in a previous relationship that resolved with some domestic violence, and she was quite younger than Andy, about 14 years younger than Andy.
Joanne, according to her family and friends, was really living a life of Camelot. But here she was with a 38-year-old man, 14 years her senior. She had a new baby. All indications from friends were that she was extremely, extremely happy.
Andy was athletic. He was strong. He was tall. He was, well, Joanne said he was everything.
But investigators know that appearances can be deceptive and start to check out Andy's alibi and other possible reasons for her disappearance.
So often a husband is an early suspect in one of these cases. Police also thought that Joanne might have fled on her own. And thirdly, there was an ex-husband as well.
In December 1994, police in Catasauqua, a borough of Lehigh County in Pennsylvania, are investigating the mysterious disappearance of 26-year-old Joanne Katrinak and her 4-month-old baby Alex. Police start looking to the alibi of her husband, Andy.
Police have a set, pat view of life as to who is responsible for criminality. The husband is always somebody who is a suspect. The ex-husband is always a suspect. And they look at these people because it turns out that most of the time there is some involvement that they can find by doing this search of the usual suspects. Well, in this case, Andy was viewed as a usual suspect, and they wanted to know, the police wanted to know about him. Well, his alibi and his whereabouts were rock solid.
They're going to try and determine what his alibi was, what he was doing, what he might know about what happened. For Andy, he was working at a friend's house that day, doing some contract work. His father was with him for part of the day, and I believe the friend, the person that he was working for, came home and spent part of the day working with him as well.
Joanne's family are also insistent that Andy has nothing to do with their disappearance.
Joanne's family were 100% behind him. Joanne's mother said, "There's just no way Andy could have harmed Joanne. I see them. I babysat for them. I see how they relate to each other. They loved each other. There's just no animosity between the two of them. There's no motive." As you know, a husband is always the first suspect when a wife disappears. And so he was looked at really carefully by the state police. But one of the things that dropped him as a suspect was what the parents, Joanne's parents, were saying about his relationship with their daughter.
With the clock ticking, the state police who have joined the investigation decide to re-examine the Katrinaks' home and Joanne's car.
State police secured the residence, processed the house, and also processed the car. Doing a good investigation and checking every possible lead is the best thing that you can do.
They wanted to examine the house again. They looked for fingerprints. They examined the door. The cut phone line had already been repaired, but they wanted to look at that area as well. And Joanne's car was taken to be searched and looked through for evidence. As far as entry into the home, police found the attempts to remove screws from the door and from a window. They didn't believe that anyone got in through the window, and the door seemed to be damaged.
A few things that they did discover, and one of the things which is underrated, is they discovered no fingerprints of any note. There were some fingerprints found on some objects in the car, but there were no fingerprints on any of the portions of the car that a driver would have touched, like the steering wheel or the gear shift or anything like that. That becomes important later on when I can make the argument that someone wiped that car down. Someone tried to hide the evidence in that car. What they do find, though, is someone who tried to wipe that car down missed. They found a tiny spot on the backrest of the driver's seat where there were 6 long, dirty blonde hairs. Along with that, and attached to that, they found very, very minute traces of blood on the backrest of that car, in the same spot where the hairs were. And then later on, it subsequently was determined that the blood had been on the hair, and therefore got onto the backrest from the hair.
The thing to remember about 1993 is that DNA was just about to become a popular item, but it wasn't widely used. Common tools police used at the time were fingerprints and serology, blood typing.
Investigators are starting to run out of other leads.
So one of the reasons why police started to move away from the theory that Joanne had simply run away. There was no usage on her credit cards. She wasn't accessing her bank, and she hadn't taken much with her. The only items that were really missing were her purse and the diaper bag. And family members said to police if she was going somewhere, she would have taken more than just that.
Reports of a missing woman and baby sends panic through the local community, and police start being inundated with calls and leads.
Nobody disappears in Catataqua in Pennsylvania. It just isn't happening. But in this case, there now was a missing person.
It always hits close to home when a member of the community, something like that happens to them, that they would go missing. Sometimes it all depends on what the circumstances are, whether the family isn't getting along. But most of the time when somebody goes missing, it's a concern to everybody.
Given the fact that it wasn't just Joanne that was missing, it was also a baby, a young child, just new to the world. It really stirs the heartstrings, particularly given the time of year, Christmas. It's a time people are thinking of family, thinking of one another, and to hear that his family is being torn apart. With a missing child, a community like Catasauqua or throughout the Lehigh Valley, we're talking about a lot of families, a lot of grandparents. Everyone is easily able to identify with a situation like this and kind of put their own family in their shoes. So when they see the posters go up, they learn that a baby is missing, that a mother is missing, it really stirs the heartstrings, and oftentimes it leads to a lot of tips. Police receive more tips than you can imagine, and oftentimes they lead in a lot of different directions. Sometimes they don't help at all.
There were all kinds of reports. This happens every time there's a case. There's some people who want to inject themselves into the case, who want to become important by thinking they've seen something that's vital. In this case, I call them my rejects. There were about 30 to 50 police reports, and they even had the FBI in the early days follow up on some of it. There was a report that she was seen in the airport. A young woman was seen with a child. There was another woman who's insistent to this day that she saw Joanne and Alex in a grocery store buying $100 worth of groceries with a tall, strange man that was with them. There was people who allegedly saw her on the railroad tracks.
The police start getting all kinds of reports, and those reports are often misleading. So difficult for the police to have all these strange reports. Oh, I saw her driving down the street. No, I saw her at the airport. Came in a report. Oh no, she was at the store just yesterday. These are things which complicate the police's life. They don't know what to think. Is this just a young woman who has had it and gone off on her own, who ran away and went to the airport? Or is this a serious problem? This kind of thing confounds law enforcement. It happens all the time, and it's a dirty, rotten shame, particularly in this case.
The search continues, but Joanne and her young son Alex have simply disappeared. Finally, 4 months later, on April 9th, 1995, the police make a breakthrough.
4 months have passed, and there still is no trace of Joanna. Nobody knows where she is. Everyone now is resigned to the reality that this young woman, beautiful mother of a brand new baby, is probably no longer with us. There's a Paul Kovacek who's in his tractor. He's a farmer. He's plowing his field, and he sees in the field clothing. It's April, so he's doing his spring plowing. And he says, gee, what is that? And he gets out of his tractor and he goes and he looks and he finds skeletal remains. He is absolutely shocked. There's clothes and there are bags and the baby things nearby, a baby rattle. And he is frightened. He calls the police. And now the whodunit really hits the fan.
April 9th, 1995. A farmer has discovered skeletal remains in woodland in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. The remains are believed to be those of Joanne Katrinak and her 4-month-old son Alex, who have been missing since December 15th, 1994.
The discovery of the remains is terrible news when a community knows that somebody is missing and you hear that remains have been found right away. Just horrible thoughts are going through the minds of everyone that's been following that case. What the police found was the skeletal remains of an adult female, and the child, the baby, was clutched to her chest to the point where she had the child's face had sunken into her chest a little bit. That positioning, when they turned the child over, it actually had preserved the child's features. Nearby, they found a rattle. They found some other of the belongings of Joanna and Alex. And I believe on the diaper bag there were some blonde hairs, very similar to the blonde hairs that were found in the car.
That's a huge break because it gives us so many different things. Number one, it gave us some forensic evidence. It gave us 2 hairs that we found there. It gave us a baby rattle, a baby bottle, a diaper bag with its contents, which were so important in establishing time of death to me. But more importantly, it got us the area. Who would have thought to place these bodies in this particular area? Usually, if you're just trying to get rid of someone that you killed, it's going to be along some highway, not in some remote area that you'd have to take right turn, left turn, right turn, left turn to get from Catasauqua to get to this remote field. So it gave us the area and it gave us some evidence. So that was a huge break.
An autopsy of the remains is able to tell police the cause of death, and an etymologist is called in to assist with when the murders might have taken place.
Forensic science has ways by which we tell how fast insects will invade the body to determine how long the body had been there. Literally, there are body farms where the scientists study the rate at which the body decays, and we can date the time. Well, the insect invasion here would indicate that the body was about 4 months old.
They did the autopsy that was ruled a homicide on both the child and Ms. Katranak. They also discovered that she had been shot in the head by a .22 caliber, and they also found that she had been bludgeoned numerous times with a blunt object. Well, the theory at the time was that Ms. Katranak was abducted from the residence in Catasauqua and taken out to a remote location known by the suspect and murdered.
Investigators give Andy the heartbreaking news and ask him if there is anyone that would want to hurt him or wish Joanne harm. Andy mentions a phone call that was received a few days before Joanne went missing.
While Andy was being interviewed, he relayed to police a rather odd phone call that had taken place before Joanne's disappearance. An ex-girlfriend of his had called, and Joanne had answered the phone. There was some confrontation. It was a little bit confrontational. The ex-girlfriend, Patricia Rohr, had wanted to speak to Andy, and Joanne had told her that that was not going to be possible and hung up the phone.
At this stage, investigators take Andy to the area where the bodies were found.
The police decided that they needed to take Andy on a tour of the area to see if he recognized anything or something was to ring a bell in his memory that might be helpful to them. They were driving around the Heidelberg area in Pennsylvania, and lo and behold, Andy says, "Wait a second, this is where my girlfriend Patricia used to board her horses. She would ride in this area. She knew this area very well." And the police said, we got a break. We got a break here. This ride-along has created a memory, and we need to follow it up.
As they started to look at Andy and some of the statements he made, and in particular in relation to Patricia, what they discovered was the night of the disappearance, or technically early the next morning, about 3 a.m., he had tried to get in touch with Patricia, even calling her mother.
So when the state police and the FBI went to speak with Patricia Rohr, they found, she explained to them that she was suspicious of the fact that they had had a child because she didn't think that Andy was able to father a child. She explained to them that she couldn't leave her residence for any length of time, that she had gone to the feed store to get some feed for her animals, and she had gone to a tanning salon.
After speaking with Patricia a second time, much of her alibi and description of events began to unravel. The first time she had been very helpful. She had spoken to police about Andy and his relationship, questioned his paternity of the child. But during this second interview, what they realized is she didn't have receipts for any of the locations she said she had gone to, including for the animal feed. And at one point she had claimed she had gone to a salon, and on that day the salon told police they were actually closed. Another explanation that Patricia gave for her whereabouts was that she had gone to a nightclub, Cowboys nightclub. When police went to check on that claim, they discovered that attendees had to sign in to the nightclub, and yet there was no sign-in for Patricia Rohr.
Police learn more about Patricia's background.
Patricia Rohr was an old girlfriend of Andy, a live-together type relationship back from, I believe, 1985 through 1989. They broke up. Seems to me it was fairly mutual. Patricia would then contact Andy. Andy would never contact her, but he'd be friendly with her when she would contact him by telephone. In 1990, Patricia Rohr asked Andy if he would help her out. Rohr was beaten up. Andy came to her rescue, and Andy let her stay in his home in 1990, the home where Joanne was taken from, for about somewhat less than a week, sometime in 1990. That relationship with Andy, as far as Andy was, it was over. As far as Patricia is concerned, we believe that she still wanted to connect with Andy on some level.
The evidence gathered from the car and crime scene gives detectives a breakthrough in the case.
There were 6 blonde hairs in the automobile that Joanna drove, that her sister discovered in front of McCarthy's. There were hairs which were discovered on Joanna's body out in the field, which were covered with blood, as were the hairs in the car, also covered with blood. And that blood turned out to be Joanna's, or perhaps the baby's blood. They weren't able to make the positive match, but it was close enough that they could tell that it was either Joanna's or the baby's blood. And then in addition, in the bags which were found at the scene of the crime, there were more blonde hairs. Now, Patricia says, I'm not blonde. I'm a brunette. I have dark hair, you see. And when the police went to talk to her, lo and behold, her hair was dark. It wasn't blonde.
Patricia was a big horse enthusiast. About the time of the incident, Patricia was involved in a riding competition. Police looked at some photos of that competition and noticed that she had blonde hair, not the dark hair that she had when they interviewed her.
But then a photograph surfaced where she was riding in a competition in Oklahoma just a couple weeks earlier than Joanna's disappearance, and she had blonde hair. The examination of the hairs that police found is that they had been bleached blonde, and this was the connection that the police were looking for.
And once a known sample from the suspect was obtained, Patricia Rohrer, we would compare the question sample from the seat back of the car to the known hair sample of Patricia Rohrer microscopically, so that we could see if the characteristics were the same or different. If they're different, that's where the examination would stop. The characteristics looked enough like the question sample from the hairs found on the seat back of Joanne Katranak's car for us to proceed with a mitochondrial DNA examination of that hair and compare the mitochondrial profile of at least one of those hairs on the seat back to the known mitochondrial DNA profile of Patricia Rohrer. At the end, we found that the mitochondrial DNA profile from Patricia Rohrer, the known, was the same as the mitochondrial DNA profile from the hair, which can't tell us that that hair came exclusively from Patricia Rohrer, but at that point we knew we could not exclude Patricia Rohrer as a source of that hair.
The things which led the police to have a strong, compelling case, one beyond a reasonable doubt, were the hairs. The DNA, the mitochondrial DNA match between those hairs found at the crime scene, found in the car, that they matched with Patricia. That really was what we will say game, set, and match. It was all over for her. But there was more. It was the lies which she told. The lies of saying, hey, I was at the Cowboy nightclub. You weren't there. Hey, I was at the salon. You weren't there. Hey, I bought feed at the grain store. Didn't have any receipts. Didn't happen. Those lies came back to absolutely haunt her. When the police went to Patricia's house and they arrested her, one of the police officers overheard Patricia saying to her newborn child, if I had known, I wouldn't have brought you into the world if I thought I was going to be caught.
But Patricia Rohrer pleads not guilty, and the case will go to trial. On June 24, 1997, Patricia Rohrer is arrested for the murders of Joanne and Alex Katranak from December 15, 1994. The Catasauqua Police and Pennsylvania state troopers investigating the murders believe they have enough evidence against her to secure a conviction.
We have the DNA, which is clearly about 60% of our case, but we also have motive, opportunity, means, false statements, phony alibis, and behavior that's just not consistent with innocence. So based on that, I told my boss that we had enough to convict, and we filed charges against her, and she was arrested on June 24th, 1997.
When police zeroed in on Patricia and decided to make a move to arrest her, they caught part of a conversation she had with her infant child, where she said, "If I had known they were going to catch me, I would have never brought you into this world."
While preparing for trial, investigators and prosecutors learn more about Rora's history.
Patricia had an odd background. It wasn't so odd as to that other people of her nature, of her ilk, didn't have similar backgrounds, but the oddities here were enough that they're noteworthy. She would live in North Carolina, then she would move away, and then she would come back. She was a car salesman with a car dealership where people said she was very personable. She worked in a photography studio with her mother, and she would do photography with clients that thought she was very good at this. Then she got into trouble with neglecting her animals, and she was charged with animal abuse, which became very significant in this case because she had to have the receipts for the feed which she fed the animals, and she didn't have it. And she was with Andy for a while, and then she was not with Andy, and then she wanted to get back together with Andy. And jealousy was so critical in the motive for this murder.
The little I know is that her father did die at an early age of hers. I think she had a back injury from a car accident. She had a marriage which didn't last very long.
Even after ending her relationship with Andy ended, friends noted that she continued to talk to Andy. Multiple ex-boyfriends mentioned that sometimes she would compare them to Andy. So for her to continue to call Andy, to find out that Andy had a child with another woman, that could certainly spark an obsession or an extreme jealousy.
Patricia Rora's trial starts on Monday, February 9th, 1998. The prosecution bases its case on forensic evidence, circumstantial evidence, and Rora's obsession with Andy Katranak.
It was a powerful opening argument for the prosecution. They pointed to 8 items. They said that she had motive, she was angry over the phone call, she was looking to be in touch with Andy, she had a weapon that matched the murder weapon, she had lied to them, she was familiar with the family's home, and she was familiar with the location where the bodies were found.
I gave 8 different areas of evidence that we would be presenting, telling the jury exactly what I was going to do in the case. I also gave them, and it's standard for me, and especially in this case, I gave them a little warning about circumstantial evidence. In Pennsylvania and in most states, if not every one of them, circumstantial evidence, if strong enough, is sufficient for you to render a verdict of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, since the evidence was largely circumstantial, I really beat that and made sure that they understood that sometimes circumstantial evidence is stronger than direct evidence. I believe that she surveilled the Katranak residence from the late hours of the 12th to the early morning hours or the midday on the 15th. I believe that she saw Andy's comings and goings. I believe she learned from his comings and goings that he went early, arrived back late. I believe that she saw Joanne's comings and goings. I believe that she saw where the car was parked. She knew the house. She knew this basement. I believe that she went down to the basement door. I believe that she first tried to take some plywood off the door, and then to make it look like there was no entry. I don't believe she wanted to make it look like a forced entry, because I believe part of her thinking was this would be pretty neat if they just disappeared and Andy became a suspect, or if no one thought that it was a murder. I believe that she didn't want to do anything there, but I believe that she wanted to abduct Joanne and Alex. I have no idea if she meant to kill them right away, Maybe she wanted to get the last word with them to really give Joanne a scare. I believe that when she heard Joanne was going out, I believe that she ambushed her as Joanne was putting Alex into the car. I believe she waited until Alex was put in the car, approached Joanne as Joanne was getting into the driver's seat, had the gun drawn on her, told Joanne, get in and drive, and that she got in the back seat. I believe she had Joanne drive to the spot where she remembered that she had ridden horses back in 1989 and 1990, because that was just a perfect place for her to have her little tete-a-tete with Joanne. I believe that at some point Joanne had to know what was going to happen and maybe started to yell. I believe that Rohr punched her in the face. Joanne had a broken nose. I believe that there was a lot of blood from that. I believe that Joanne struggled. I believe that Rohr won the struggle. And I believe that Rohr shot her and then stomped her. I believe that Rohr got back into her car, changed the seat so that she could fit into it, drove back, parked the car in McCarty's after dark. She wouldn't have done it during daylight. Got back in her van, which was parked somewhere in the neighborhood, not in McCarty's, and drove back to North Carolina.
This is a case of jealousy. This is a case of where a phone call is made and a woman says to another woman, get out of my life. I am with this man now. He's not yours. This is jealousy, which seems to be one of the most ancient of motives for killing. It was something that triggered an uncontrollable rage, which resulted in shooting a woman in the face. 19 bludgeoning injuries to her body, and the death of a newborn child. Jealousy. Powerful, powerful tragedy.
Some more really good detective work is our forensics showed that the bullet that was removed from Joanne's skull could have been fired by certain types of firearms. One of them was a .22 Jennings. Other ones too, but it was circumstantial evidence they were looking for a possible .22 Jennings as a murder weapon. The death could have been caused by either the shot to the face or the blunt blows to the body. Either one separately could have been the cause of death, but blunt force and shot to face were the cause of death.
Police were never able to locate the firearm that was used to kill Joanne. They did know it was a .22 caliber handgun. An ex-boyfriend told police that Patricia did have a .22 caliber handgun. She had purchased it from a gentleman in a wheelchair.
When they discovered the body in the field and the coroner examined it, they could tell that there was a gunshot right to her face, which was the cause of her death and the fatal blow, and they could tell that it was a .22 caliber bullet, which caused her death. They're looking for somebody with a gun, a .22. They asked Patricia, do you own a gun? No, she does not have a gun, she said. Well, that turned out to be an absolute lie. The former boyfriend of Patricia said, oh, gee, we went to a garage sale, and there was this guy. He was in a wheelchair, and he had a .22 gun, and he sold it to Patricia. But the gun was really strange because it only could do one shot, and then it would jam. So all you could expect from this gun is one bullet. Well, this was a lie that trapped Patricia.
I think that $50 gun was thrown away in the nearest pond as soon as the crime was committed. I had no idea, nor did my investigators, nor did my forensic pathologist, as to what blunt instrument was used to brutally beat Joanne. I don't think we were thinking outside the box at the time.
The jury leaves to deliberate, and it is an anxious time for the prosecution and investigators.
My glass is always half empty, And so even though I thought we presented the best possible case we could, and I thought, parenthetically, that she was her own worst enemy, she convicted herself by her attempting to lie about every issue in the case. Ridiculous lies, things that made her, to anybody, look absolutely guilty. So I was pretty well convinced that she had convicted herself. But I'm always worried about what a jury is going to do. The jury was out 4 hours, came back with 2 questions, went back, half hour later, convicted her. This is after a 4-week trial. She got life in prison without possibility of parole. And, you know, I have to say this, is that the victim's family, Joanne's parents, were against the death penalty. They told me that, and so I did not advocate for the death penalty. But it's not my call. It's the jury's call, and this is a death penalty case. It really is. I mean, the murder of a woman and a 4-month-old baby. But I left it completely in the hands of the jury, and I did telegraph to the jury that I was not requiring or asking for the death penalty. I've never been a death penalty proponent.
I was happy that our exams worked and gave the prosecutor information that could be used to help the jury make a decision about what happened in the case.
If I was going to ask Patricia one thing, it would be, was it worth the life of a mother and child?
May 24th, 2004, Iowa. A woman is found brutally murdered in an RV parking lot.
The most disturbing thing was just the amount of blood. Having that moment to imagine what would have happened in those moments that she had.
It was just a very violent, emotional attack.
Police suspect her ex-boyfriend, who has just been arrested for the murder of a second victim, Michael Zawodny.
This was a suicide mission from the very beginning. He was going to kill 2 people, and then he was going to kill himself. He's a narcissist. He don't care about anyone but himself.
Police look to uncover the motive behind the brutal double murder.
He could not walk away. This was his answer.
His motive was he just wanted to kill them all. If he couldn't have her, nobody was going to have her.
This is the story of Sally Kennedy and Michael Zawodny, their gruesome murders, and how a killer tries to manipulate the court into believing his innocence.
He was jealous of her both romantically and I think professionally.
Some of these guys do it for control. It's their last grasp at control. They want to be able to ask the questions that they want, and they want to be able to say what they want. And this is the only way they can do it.
May 24th, 2004. Law enforcement is called to a murder scene in the city of Council Bluffs, Iowa. Local police have discovered a dead woman while carrying out a welfare check. A welfare check is a request for police to stop at a person's home to make sure they are safe.
I was working as a detective in our Criminal Investigations Bureau. I received a call about 12:30 a.m. from my direct supervisor, Sergeant Jerry Mann. He had advised that there had been a homicide that had been committed at one of our local casinos in the RV parking lot. Bluffs Run Casino was mainly a dog track. So they had live dog racing, stuff like that. So it wasn't uncommon for people that were traveling through to stop over for a night. Her case was somewhat unique in that she had been there for several days to up to a couple of weeks because she was in town for work and she had brought her camper and parked it there. I was told to respond with a few other detectives to go ahead and take control of the crime scene and start the investigation.
Police on the scene have information about the likely suspect.
I was briefed when I arrived on location that we had one deceased. I was also briefed that the suspect was already in custody and that he had committed a second homicide across the state line in Nebraska down in Bellevue, which is about 15 minutes away from Council Bluffs. So it was a unique situation in that we already knew who was possibly responsible for our homicide, and we had been advised that he had made statements to that effect, which is the reason why that they went to the camper to do the welfare check in the first place.
The victim is identified as 45-year-old Sally Kennedy. Her daughter, Sam Kennedy, who requested the welfare check, is speaking with police.
They had to get a key from Samantha, but they told her to stay back. And they entered, and if it's such a small, it's 45-foot trailer, which is huge, but as soon as they stepped in, they looked to the right, and they saw Sally. And that's when they immediately backed out and, did a secure on it and told her that her mom was deceased.
It was a very tough time for Samantha. Again, her mother was brutally murdered on the day that she graduated from high school. This is just days after she had lost her father. We did wait a little bit before we sat down with Samantha to give her some time because she had to be suffering from complete shock over the things that had transpired.
Forensics arrive and alongside investigators start examining the crime scene.
Beginning the processing of the scene, it's an examination and a walkthrough around the trailer. So photographs are taken of the exterior of the trailer, the door to the trailer, if there was any damage done on a possible entry or exit. Photographs are taken once inside the trailer to document what the scene looked like on arrival. A video is also taken of the exterior and interior of the trailer, again to depict what is being seen by myself at the arrival of the scene. We take yellow evidence tents or stickers with numbers on them and go through the trailer to mark any possible items of evidence. We choose what we believe is evidence. And so it could be finding a knife, finding bloodstain patterns, finding anything that's broken, we think may be evidence. Any bloodstains that are outside of concentration of where the crime occurred, to show that of any travel of somebody through. Any weapons are marked, and it is kind of, as a crime scene or identification technician, it's a bit of a guessing game as to what is evidence and what could be evidence.
Immediately upon walking into the camper, you can tell that there had been a disturbance there, a physical disturbance. Things were out of place, strewn across the floor of the camper. To our immediate right was the small bathroom where Miss Kennedy was actually found. There was a large amount of blood. There was broken items. It was pretty easy to tell that there had been quite a violent struggle.
Laying right there on the floor, face down in a very large puddle of blood, was Sally. She was obviously deceased. There was blood spatter all up against sort of the walls and the area around the whole bathroom area. She had 22 stabbing and cutting wounds on her, the worst of which was, sort of across her face and also across her throat. The throat wound went all the way to her vertebrae, and so that's obviously was the fatal wound, what killed her. She also had stab wounds on her torso. It was a pretty bad scene. The knife that had been used to kill her was just left sitting on the sink in the bathroom right next to the body.
Crime scenes all tell a story, you just gotta listen. You could tell exactly what went down in there. It was telling me it was very violent struggle in there. There was the shower door that had been broken off. There was blood splatter on the ceiling, the walls, the toilet area, the sink area.
Investigators gather as much evidence as they can at the crime scene.
You want to make sure that all the witnesses are being interviewed, that the crime scene is being processed properly. The measurements, the photos, that type of thing, the swabs, the DNA.
We found mountains of evidence. We found blood evidence. throughout the trailer. We found the weapon that we believed was possibly used in the homicide was still on the location. We found evidence that there had been some sort of search of the trailer after the homicide had occurred, just from the placement of where we found the blood evidence. It seemed pretty obvious that the assailant had injured himself during the assault, because there was blood places that probably shouldn't have been if it was our victim's blood. One of those things was a Bacardi bottle that we found on the bathroom vanity. It appeared that maybe he had gone to the refrigerator and actually retrieved a drink, because we did find blood evidence inside of the refrigerator also. We found gun cases that were empty. We knew at this point already that the second homicide in Nebraska had been carried out with 2 firearms that they felt like may have been stolen from our crime scene. And we did find evidence of that when we went through and did our initial search of the trailer.
Sally's body is carefully bagged to preserve evidence, and investigators attend the autopsy.
At the autopsy, Sally Kennedy is cleaned so that the injuries can be documented, photographed, measured, placed on a diagram that the pathologist creates. The pathologist relayed to me that there were 22 injuries.
The throat wound was the fatal one. I mean, I recall that she had some pretty bad stab wounds at the torso, but don't recall that any of those penetrated into vital organs. She basically had her carotid artery, jugular vein, severed. This is a slash of wound across the throat that went all the way to her cervical vertebrae. So, she, essentially, almost was decapitated with this wound. And so that she just bled out.
And I noticed a very significant one on her hand, on her thumb, where that was very deep. She may have fought back her attacker based on the depth on her thumb.
The way her body was attacked, it told a story. It really did tell a story about how she fought, how she wanted to live.
The pathologist will take known samples of blood from our victim. That tube of blood is handed over to myself to put into evidence to be processed at the crime laboratory. So we have a known sample of her blood. So we have her known DNA. At the autopsy as well, fingerprints and palm prints are taken so that we have her fingerprints and palm prints. Any fingerprints that were collected at the scene then can be compared to hers. So that way we don't have an unknown fingerprint, we can say it's hers. And if we do have an unknown fingerprint, then it's possible we can identify that to somebody else.
The pathologist is able to provide investigators with a cause of death.
Severe blood loss due to the cut and stab wounds that she had.
Police look into the victim and try to paint a picture of who Sally Kennedy was.
What we learned about Sally Kennedy was that she was a mother, she was a business owner, she was a religious woman, she attended church regularly.
She had a son and a daughter. The son was a couple years younger than Sam. She was a pretty shrewd businesswoman. Running a carnival that's a challenging business. It's just, a lot of the folks that are, attracted to the carnival business, they appreciate sort of the independence of the road. But a lot of times these are folks that, that don't maybe play well with others, that have, maybe had their own run-ins with authority over the years. And so, being able to sort of hold a group of these folks together, I think she did a good job with it. And I think it was a successful, operation.
She was recently divorced, so there was, some of that going on in her life, which I think may have contributed to her falling in with this Michael Gunther character, who was basically the polar opposite of what Sally Kennedy was. He was very self-centered. He was, for lack of a better term, a fraud. He lied a lot to people. He did things that were not genuine. He stole from people. He had several other instances of theft and fraud before meeting Sally Kennedy. But Sally Kennedy was just your typical mother, business owner. She worked hard. She worked long hours. And until she met Michael Gunther, it looked like her life was relatively happy.
They met at a convention in Las Vegas. It started off as a business relationship that turned romantic, a little bit about both. I believe he saw her as his money train. what she was is what he wanted to become. And through her, he was going to be able to get it.
May 2004. Investigators in Council Bluffs, Iowa, are investigating the ferocious murder of Sally Kennedy, a traveling carnival owner. Her ex-boyfriend, Michael Gunther, is the lead suspect, and detectives are delving into his background and his relationship with Sally, hoping to uncover a motive.
He was from the Chicago area, and he was a carnival owner and game owner.
He kind of just floated around, and he was a man of opportunity. So if he saw an opportunity to make a buck here or there, he would do that. And, there was plenty of instances, again, of him being involved in fraud and theft and intimidation, which we found that over and over when we spoke with people about his demeanor and his inability to get along with just about anyone. He was, for lack of a better term, a big bully. And I think he spent the majority of his adult life bullying people and looking for opportunities to prey on any situation that he thought would benefit him personally.
And at some point met Sally Kennedy in Las Vegas. And at that point, they joined forces, and I think in the second year of them being together, then he brought his games into the carnival.
What she was looking for was someone to sort of help manage the other ride owners and concessionaires as far as just sort of supervising how the carnival's laid out. I mean, this is sort of a massive undertaking for these traveling carnivals, right? Every day they roll into a place, they have to unload everything, set it up, lay it out in the space, and then obviously they run the carnival, and then they got to knock it all down, get it back on the trucks, travel to their next location, do it all over with. And so I think he was brought in really initially to just sort of help with the logistics of running the carnival. He'd owned carnivals himself apparently in the past. The relationship became romantic, and he ultimately sort of moved in with her around November of 2003. So he was living with her in her trailer, as well as I think her house up in Climbing Hill. As the carnival season sort of ramped up in 2004, then he would have been traveling with her and living in her trailer with her. That's sort of where I think his management style wasn't really conducive to what she was looking for. He seemed to be in a lot of conflicts with the other ride operators. He was a very manipulative, controlling person. Carnival operators, they tend to be an independent breed of people. They're not maybe great with people just, trying to drop the control on them all the time. Pretty independent. And I think, having somebody like Gunther that thought he was going to sort of come in, order everybody around, was causing some friction.
He was also the guy who ran and got maintenance parts and things like that. And there may have been some allegation that he was double dipping, or he was turning in receipts for parts that were never received, and that was one of the issues for him to be removed from the carnival.
She had thrown him out 2 other times before, but Michael Gunther was such a manipulator, and he was so controlling that he was somehow able to work his way back into her good graces enough to be involved with the carnival again. He treated Sally very well when he wasn't being angry or, mean over money or whatever. So he wined and dined her. That was a quote from one of the interviews. He would bring her flowers very often, and he would take her out for special dinners. And I think, the part of Sally Kennedy wanted to believe that that's the biggest part of Michael Gunther. And unfortunately, it turned out that was just a facade that he put on to get what Michael Gunther wanted to get, which was ultimately to get into her business and profit from her hard work.
I don't think he had much character, I'll be honest. I think he was a leech. He was just there to leech on to Sally, to try to take over her business eventually. He had dreams of doing that. I don't think he was much of a man without having someone to leech upon, and that's why when he was getting kicked off the money train, normal folks would move on, but for him, like a leech, he'll die if he gets taken off.
Police in neighbouring Sarpy County have Michael Gunther in custody. He has been charged with the killing of Michael Zawodny. A fellow carnival worker, John Hanna, witnessed the murder.
Mr. Hanna was working the carnival. He knew both parties. John Hanna initially saw Mr. Gunther come onto the midway and approach Mr. Zawodny. And they then began to walk behind the games. And knowing the history between the two of not having a very good relationship, I think he was a little concerned. So he followed them. He walked around behind the games and he saw Mr. Gunther there with Mr. Zawodny, and he also saw Mr. Gunther raise a gun and shoot Mr. Zawodny.
Another worker also gives Sarpy police information.
Chris was working that evening as well, and he was the mechanic for the carnival. And he had seen Mr. Gunther come in, and he was talking to one of his guys. And Chris went to talk to him to see about a certain device he was supposed to repair, and he was given some instruction, and then Gunther walked away. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual about him. Not too long after that, he heard about 6 gunshots. He was still on the Midway area. And he ran up around there, and then he saw the remainder of the shots. He saw Gunther fire out the rest of the rounds. Mr. Gunther looked at Chris and said, "This is the that's been Sally." And then he turned and he put another 4 or 5 rounds into Mr. Zawodny's body in a head and neck area. And the gun locked back. That was the .22 caliber Ruger. It locked back as it was out of ammunition. And so Chris could tell that there was no more ammunition in it. And he was screaming at him, "What are you doing? Put it down. You're out of," because he had the gun to his head. Mr. Gunther had the firearm to his head. Could tell that there was no ammunition in it, so he was screaming at him, "What are you doing? Put it down." And whether he was intending to do anything with that or whether that was for show, I don't really know. But shortly after that then is when Josh Minders ran forward and tackled him. Josh Minders was a civilian at that moment. He was active military, but he wasn't in uniform, so he was just enjoying the carnival with his family. And he heard what he thought were gunshots, and he's a military police officer, so he went straight to investigate. As he approached, he saw what was going on, and he also saw that there were some other people on the other side, including military police officers, and he didn't want to get directly in the line of fire. But as he saw the last shot go, he thought he saw an opportunity, and he ran and he tackled Mr. Gunther to the ground. At that point, he also saw a .38 caliber weapon. He grabbed that weapon and he threw it away from both of them. And then he held Mr. Gunther in custody until security forces could arrive and take him into custody.
After he killed Michael, and he says, "I'm dead, Sally's dead, and now he's dead." They believe him. They wanted to do a welfare check. And her daughter, Samantha, wanted to do a welfare check. And so that's why they ended up going to Bluffs Run.
Once Gunther was taken into custody by the military police, he was held, the scene was secured, the sheriff's department was called and came on scene and then took over the investigation component of it. The victim was taken by life flight to a local hospital to see if they could save the victim, revive the victim. They were unsuccessful. And so resulting from that was the law enforcement charge of murder in the first degree and use of a weapon to commit a felony.
So who is the man that Michael Gunther shot in cold blood? And what is the history of their relationship?
The victim was a Michael Zawodny, who was an owner of some of the games at the carnival. Yeah, he had a son named Jacob. He was a single father. He and Jacob traveled together, and they had a great time, and they had a great life. He was a good carnival gamesman. He was well-liked.
Given the extremely violent manner of death, an autopsy is performed on Michael Zawodny's body.
The autopsy was relatively quick. I don't remember it being more than probably about 45 minutes or an hour.
The autopsy was taken at the Douglas County morgue. I was present. And Dr. Jones completed the autopsy. In the autopsy, he examined the body, certainly on an external examination first, noting bullet holes and certain defects that were present. In the end, he noted 11 bullet holes that were found in the body of Mr. Zawodny. There was also a bullet defect in his left hand on his ring finger, indicating a defensive posture when he was shot. Cause and manner of death was multiple gunshot wounds to Mr. Zawodny. There were 6 gunshot wounds to the head and neck area. There were 4 to the trunk area and 1 to his thigh.
Council Bluffs officers working Sally Kennedy's murder meet up with their counterparts investigating Michael Zawodny's murder to exchange information.
We had the Sarpy County Sheriff's Office involved. So we had to sit down with them and make time and share information back and forth between their department and our department on both of these investigations, because they were absolutely connected. Even though they occurred at two separate locations at two different times in two different states, these were absolutely connected.
Investigators interview friends, family, and work colleagues and begin to develop a motive for the brutal double slaying. May 2004, police teams in Council Bluffs, Iowa and Sarpy County, Nebraska are investigating the brutal double murders of Sally Kennedy and Michael Zawodny. Their suspected killer, Michael Gunther, is in custody, and investigators are piecing together the events leading up to their deaths.
This sort of all culminates May 20th. Sally decided that she was cutting ties with him romantically. I think she had concluded that this just wasn't going to be a long-term thing. In Gunther's mind, this was going to be, I think he thought this was a permanent relationship. And of course, that's what he wanted. I mean, it didn't sound like maybe financially he had a lot going on. Sally, her carnival's doing quite well. And so I think he sort of maybe thought this was his meal ticket. She sort of tells him on May 20th that the romantic relationship is over. And she also, basically demotes him. I think just basically took away his supervisory role. He just wasn't handling conflict with the other people that were, working with the carnival well. And so, he was at that time, I think, still going to be welcome to have his ride, travel along with the carnival. But as far as their relationship, he was no longer going to be a supervisor, and he was no longer going to be her romantic love interest. The next day, May 21st, her ex-husband passed away of a heart attack, lived in Council Bluffs. And when her ex-husband died, she still, I think, had a lot of feelings for him, still felt close to him, and so it was pretty devastating for Sally. And Gunther is having, no sorts of sympathy about it. He's all concerned about wanting to get back together with her romantically. He was wanting to have her put him back into place as far as his supervisory role, and she's devastated. I mean, she's emotionally dealing with him. This is the father of her child that she still has feelings for. His just lack of empathy, I think, for what she was going through convinced her that no longer does this really need to just be a demotion, but that he needed to just cut ties and leave. 22nd, she sort of told him, I think your time with the carnival is going to be done, and that you need to just move back to Chicago when we move on. Then the 23rd is the day of her daughter's graduation from high school. And so she's looking forward to going to it, but she's also still, dealing with the emotion of what is going on. For some reason, she invites Gunther to accompany her to her daughter's high school graduation ceremony. They go to the graduation ceremony. They headed over to Omaha, Nebraska, and had lunch, and then sort of went their separate ways. And her daughter had said that Sally seemed happy during the meal, and that Gunther was agitated. Sam, I don't think had really ever liked Mike Gunther anyway in his relationship with her mom. But, they sort of went their separate ways. And so she knew that Sally had sort of given him his marching orders, and that he had a few items that were still left, I think, in the trailer. There was a drawer where he had some clothes. And so knew that there was at some point some time where he had to come and sort of collect the rest of his things. Then he'd head back to the carnival, and I think the understanding was that, on the 24th, when the carnival was loading up, that he'd be loading up and moving on.
By this point, Michael Gunther's anger is silently building to dangerous levels.
He was seething all day long. I think he had been seething for days about this. I think that the decision to demote him and, sort of cut ties romantically with him, that hurt. He's a controller, he's a manipulator, and the fact that he still has access to Sally, I think in his mind, he always felt like, I'll be able to manipulate my way back in, right? When the day before, she tells him, we're done. You're going to be leaving now. I think that began a slow burn in him that continued throughout that day. A little of the jealousy of her ex-husband as well is in play here, because she's pretty emotionally upset, by somebody. And if Gunther and Sally were truly soulmates, why is she so upset at the death of her ex-husband, who she still really loves? And so I think his thought of how dare she get rid of me in favor of these other men, and whether that's romantically or professionally or however, I think he just was in the middle of a slow burn. And he knew that his last opportunity to see Sally was going to be when he's getting his stuff. There was some attempt at reconciliation by him that it was rebuffed, that she's like, nope, this isn't going to happen, this is for real, and you need to, collect your things, and he wasn't going to take it.
Investigators have been interviewing Michael Gunther, but he keeps claiming complete loss of memory.
I thought he was just being dishonest. I did not think that he had blacked out for 3 days. He even did a television interview where he completely contradicted that and basically admitted that he had killed both Sally Kennedy and Michael Zawodny. These are the kind of tricks that untruthful people will use when they're trying to avoid the justice system. So it wasn't that surprising that he would use some sort of defense like that. There was really no defense for what he had done. I mean, he was looking at the potential of basically 2 life sentences or even possibly a death sentence in the state of Nebraska.
Michael Gunther is charged with the murders and first goes to trial in Nebraska for the murder of Michael Zawodny. His defense is shocked when he decides to represent himself.
I've handled pro se cases, where the defendants decide to represent themselves. That almost always is a horrible choice. Everyone has a constitutional right to the effective assistance of counsel. Everyone also has the constitutional right to represent themselves.
It puts the defense lawyers in a bad position. They kind of just have to sit back and let the guy do what he wants, but yet they don't step in unless they're needed. So they almost feel like their hands are tied behind their back and just watching this guy on a slowly sinking ship. I think some of these guys do it for control. It's their last grasp at control. They want to be able to try to control those witnesses. They want to be able to ask the questions that they want. And they want to be able to say what they want.
Michael Gunther's behavior in court escalates as he attempts to control the court.
Stood up and asked for the death penalty in his pickle suit. The pickle suit is, like a poncho type item. It's made of quilted fabric, ripstop fabric, and it fits on the defendant, but it's a sleeveless poncho style thing. And it's meant for people who are suicidal or at special risk. Wouldn't change out of that suit and get into a nice civilian suit that he was offered. And he stood up, had an argument basically with the judge about the ability of the jury to give him the death penalty, and then stood up, gave his own opening, and asked for it anyway.
Things didn't go as planned, as he had planned. He didn't think he was going to get that far. So he's just thinking of a way out. What can I do to disrupt these proceedings as much as possible, to shake things up? I think that was his mindset, and that's why he did that.
I thought he was putting on a show. I thought he was gaming it. I thought he was trying to manipulate the circumstances and, again, either go for some sort of temporary insanity or some competency issue to try to derail the trial.
Gunther's claims go unheard, and the jury deliberate and return with their verdict.
I'm always a little nervous when something goes to the jury. You never know what's going to happen. You don't know what they would have thought about him. It just takes one to say no, and we got to start all over. But I was very confident in our evidence, and in our presentation, and the fact that the jury understood. I took it as a good sign that they came back very quickly, and it was guilty on all counts.
After his trial in Nebraska for the murder of Michael Zawodny, Gunther is extradited to Iowa to face trial for the murder of Sally Kennedy.
We'd had some folks ask us, like, why? Why are you bringing him over? He's already looking at life plus 50 in Nebraska. Why would you, are you wasting the taxpayers' dollars by bringing him over to face trial? There wasn't a hard choice for us at all. I mean, A, Sally still deserves justice on her case. She got murdered. She's really the genesis of this, and I really felt like she deserved certainly the respect of us handling this case and doing what we could to bring justice for her. But also, I've seen plenty of cases that don't survive on appeal. I mean, I know what's gone down in Nebraska, right? Right at the eve of trial, he's trying the case in a green foam suicide prevention suit where he's fired his attorneys and he's asking for the death penalty. What if Court of Appeals in Nebraska decides he didn't get a fair trial and they overturn his conviction, right? So I really felt like we had sort of a duty to get some insurance on him as well. And so that's why we decided that we were going to go forward with this case and have a trial of our own.
But Gunther is not done with attempts to manipulate the court, the trial, and justice. 2005, Council Bluffs, Iowa. Michael Gunther is going on trial for the murder of his ex-girlfriend Sally Kennedy. He has already been given a life sentence in Nebraska for the murder of Michael Zawodny. Once again, he tries to manipulate the trial.
What stunts could he pull when this is a guy that has fired his attorney at the last minute and decided to represent himself? If he's willing to do that, what is he willing to do in Iowa when we're having to deal with him? It's just one of those things, right? Once you're in trial, you just sort of have to see how things go. And he ends up taking the stand, and he testified mostly consistently with what he had said in Nebraska. But he'd obviously changed his defense strategy, right? When he's in Nebraska and he's dealing with Zawodny, he's basically like, I just want to be with Sally. I want the death penalty. I did this. Forgive me. He gets to Iowa. Well, now he's already got a life plus 50, and I think he had changed his mind, right? At this point, he's like, I'm not going to get the death penalty. He probably thought he had some chance for appeal. So he's changed his defense strategy. So his defense strategy in the Iowa case was that he wanted manslaughter, not murder. And in Iowa, for you to get a voluntary manslaughter, he has to establish basically that there was provocation on the part of the victim, that a reasonable person would have been felt the impulse to kill because of provocation.
That was his version of events. However, in none of the interviews that we conducted did we ever find any evidence that she was having any other relationship outside of Michael Gunther. There was some talk by some people that were really close to her that she was even considering the possibility of a reconciliation with her ex-husband.
And Iowa says words alone are not enough, right? So even if it happened as he testified in Nebraska that she's mocking him about his sexual performance, if she's telling him that she slept around with a bunch of people, that's not enough to get you to a voluntary manslaughter because words alone aren't enough. So his testimony shifted. The surprise, I suppose, that hit us is by the time he took the stand here, he alleged that she pushed him and she slapped him and she was kicking, that she had physically assaulted him, and in addition to mocking him, and that's what put him over the edge and caused him to commit the murder. So at this point, we read his transcript into evidence in our trial from the Nebraska trial. We played the interview that he gave to the TV station as well, because we wanted to show the jury that he's just trying to manipulate them, just as he's been trying to manipulate everyone else, trying to sell them a bill of goods, that had really no support, that this just was a convenient story for him at the time.
The prosecution calls Sally's daughter, Sam Kennedy, to testify.
She had a lot on her shoulders, but I also knew she was very strong. She had a lot of her mother's traits in her, so I knew she'd do fine on the stand. And I wanted her, in her own words, to be able to tell that jury what her mom was like. She was a loving mom. She was an entrepreneur. She was strong, very good businesswoman. But at the end of the day, that was her mom.
She talked about how the day went and how Gunther's attitude was. I mean, that was important for us also, right? Because we wanted to show his demeanor earlier in the day, that he's sullen, that he's agitated. This isn't something like they're all happy-go-lucky sitting at dinner and then all of a sudden, something must have happened. We knew premeditation would be tough, but we at least thought, I think, that she sort of provided us with at least circumstantial evidence that he's already brooding, about what's going to happen even as early as that afternoon.
The evidence found at the scene is damning.
DNA was very important in this case. They knew each other, and they had a relationship. So having some DNA in the trailer made sense. But the amount of blood and what blood was where told a different story.
We were able to show that Michael Gunther, after the assault and committing this murder in Council Bluffs of Sally Kennedy, that he stayed in the trailer for a lengthy amount of time after the murder. So he was in there for, we estimated, at least 7 to 10 minutes, gathering the guns that he used to kill Michael Zawodny. And then he even had time to stop and have a drink, an alcoholic drink, before he left and drove over to Bellevue, where he committed the second murder.
He said, I killed her, and now I'm going to kill him. That statement.
If we didn't have his DNA, if he hadn't cut himself and he hadn't made those statements, he could have said, I came into the trailer, I saw Sally in a pool of her own blood, I believe Michael Zawodny did it, and I grabbed her guns and headed over to avenge the killing of my loved one. I mean, that defense, I'm not saying it would sell, but it's at least something that somebody could make with a straight face.
A lot of evidence left behind. The reason being, of course, is he didn't plan on being around. He planned on killing himself. You know, you got the two different type of killers. I mean, the ones who do it in the shadows, they want to get away and not have anyone know they did it. Then you have the dangerous ones who don't care, and they're not planning on sticking around for it.
He basically showed absolutely no remorse. He went with this amnesia defense, so that he could basically sit there, I believe, and not have to show any emotion, because if he couldn't remember that he had done the act, then certainly he wouldn't have to show any remorse for the act itself. There was no emotion. There was no real remorse for any of the family or for either of his victims. He basically just sat there with a blank look on his face for the amount of the trial.
The jury comes back with a verdict, but it isn't the result the prosecution expected.
I was disappointed a little bit with the second-degree murder. We charged him with first-degree murder. I feel like it absolutely was first-degree murder. And, of course, you want to always win your case the way that you charge it.
We knew that premeditation, that we did not have really any direct evidence of that. I mean, this was going to be sort of just the circumstances. And honestly, the only circumstances we had were that he's only on scene for 15 minutes. Iowa has a presumption, if you use a dangerous weapon, then the jury is allowed to presume that it was done with premeditation, but they're not required to. And so ultimately, that's a jury decision. I mean, I tell jurors all the time, you are the most powerful unit, in our country as we speak right now about this case. This is 100% your decision to make. If you believe he premeditated it and that we proved it, then you should find him guilty of first-degree murder. And if you don't believe we've proved that, then you should find him guilty of second-degree murder. But this is no manslaughter. This is not a case that she provoked anything. She did not deserve what happened to her. This is clearly a case of murder, and you have to make the call.
He's going to spend a lot of his life in the state of Iowa penitentiary system if he ever finishes serving his sentence in Nebraska.
Michael Gunther will be behind bars for the rest of his life. But what was the driving force behind the murders?
He was jealous that he was going to lose Sally Kennedy. In his mind, he was losing Sally to Michael Zawodny. And he was a competitor with whom he didn't get along with, so that was very much a pain for him, very painful. And you throw on the fact that he was being thrown out of the carnival, then I'm not sure what greater insult could have been levied on him. I guess for him, that was his world. That was everything. That was enough to do what he did.
Is there any sense of closure for Sally Kennedy's children?
I don't think there's ever closure if you have someone close to you who's been violently murdered. Because I'm sure that every day Samantha thinks of her mom, Sally.
If there's true justice, I could bring people back. We can't do that. And I tell that to family members. All I can promise you is that we will treat the memory of your loved one with respect, that we will do the best we can to make sure that they are held accountable under the law the best we can, and that in this world, that's the best we can do. There's always a hole, right? There's always going to be a hole in people's lives. You lose a loved one. Sam, I'm sure, is still dealing with grief from the loss of her father with a heart attack. So it doesn't even have to be a horrifically violent death. I think to still have those be a problem. But, we hear that, it's sort of cliche, time heals all wounds. I don't know if it heals it. We build up scar tissue, right? We're able to deal with it, better. I think it becomes a dull pain and not such a sharp pain. I don't know that there really is ever closure. I know in states that have capital punishment, they've interviewed victims' families afterwards, and they may feel satisfied, when an execution is complete, but I don't know that they ever even really feel closure in that circumstance. It's just, she should not have died the way she did.